can begin to approach these problems. And I also want to give a short report. My name is Linda De Hoyos. I'm the Asia editor of EIR. There are some changes in this program which I will go through. But before I get into the session, I'd like to report that on a press conference that we had today in Mexico City by Dennis Small, the editor of Ibero-American for EIR, Executive Intelligence Review, and Carlos Cota, who's an executive member of our organization in Mexico. They presented a special report which we have produced on the Mexican debt crisis. It is called, appropriately enough, "The Mexican Debt Bomb Explodes, Who's Next?" This had very good attendance at the press conference. We have to see what type of coverage will come out of it, including the top newspaper Excelsior in Mexico, Financiero, Multimix news agency, and television. And Dennis went through the discussion of the massive capital flight that occurred in Mexico, which precipitated this crisis, and also gave the outline and the history of Lyndon LaRouche's 9th forecast of the international global financial mudslide, which we are now in, and which was manifesting itself very clearly in the Mexican run that we just saw in the last couple weeks. Tonight they are having a seminar to which business and government people will be attending on this whole issue. So we can see from what has occurred in Mexico that no matter what the financial press in London and New York, no matter what the Wall Street Journal would like to say, that we are in a global financial crisis which is unstoppable given the exorbitant magnitude of the speculative debt bubble which exists in the world today, which is many times greater than the entire amount of world trade. That offers us, on the one hand, a tremendous danger. On the other hand, it offers us an opportunity to clear this debt, this speculative paper away, and to proceed with global development. And it is on this issue of global development that we are going to address ourselves today. The first speaker will be Kathy Wolfe, who is an economist and also an expert on Asia in particular. She works with the Executive Intelligence Review, and she is going to give us an overview of the plans for global development in particularly Europe, Eurasia, and also in Africa. And then Marcia Mary, who is the agricultural editor of the Executive Intelligence Review and also an economist and geographer, will give a presentation on our specific plans for the United States, because I think, as everyone who lives here knows, the United States economy has a tremendous deficit within the actual physical economy. I just want to give a couple of announcements first. First, we still have keys, a missing set of keys which can be picked up back at the desk, the security desk there. And secondly, these presentations both involve slides. And if you cannot, there's a slide screen, and if you can't see this screen, you should probably move now so that you can, since it will be difficult to follow the presentations if you can't. So. Hotel room. Okay. Everybody can see now? Okay. So our first speaker is Mrs. Kathy Wolfe.
Good afternoon. In recent decades, the necessary interventions by man into nature, infrastructure projects for transportation, water, power, and housing have been stopped by the bankers of the IMF or simply not been made. Hundreds of millions of the world's population of close to 6 billion people are therefore suffering needlessly and having a massive decline in their physical standards of consumption. This map is the European, African, Asian landmass where most of the world's people live. Since his trip to India during World War II, and since the publication of his International Development Bank proposal in 1975, Lyndon LaRouche has been calling for infrastructure-grade projects around the world to put the most modern technology, now the property of only the few, into the hands of all of the human race. Had LaRouche's plans been implemented, we would not be facing, either here in America or in Africa and around the world, the genocides of Rwanda, the floods, and the other disasters we see today. Rail lines, such as shown here in red, from Europe to Africa and from the Atlantic across Russia and China to Japan, were the great projects which Mr. LaRouche referenced this morning, planned an entire century ago, 100 years ago, by French Foreign Minister Gabriel Hanotaux and Russian Finance Minister Sergei Witte. In an 1896 treaty, they proposed to unite this vast continent with steam-powered rail to bring steam power for basic industry to billions of people who in that day were still working with their bare hands and who are today still working with their bare hands into the hands of the average person and to multiply the effectiveness of their labor many times over. But Britain's colonial rule depended on a naval monopoly, on communications and transportation. Britain's empire would have been made obsolete by these railroads, along with their policy of keeping the population at the living standard of beasts, and the British destroyed these projects. The Pacific Basin shown here is the home of most of the world's people today. In fact, even Wall Street recognizes that, and they say, well, let them all eat PCs. But 2 decades ago, Lyndon LaRouche, in his 1975 International Development Bank plan, proposed a dozen great projects here. Major infrastructure projects, such as expanding the Suez Canal between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, a massive development of India's Ganges-Brahmaputra River Valley, building an entirely new canal, which he mentioned this morning, across Thailand to link the Indian Ocean to the Pacific and make Singapore obsolete, and a second canal across the Isthmus of Panama. In 1983, Mr. LaRouche published a Pacific Basin report in full documentation which proposed that this entire basin should be circled with superports and new canals. LaRouche pointed out that these canals and cities must be linked by a brand new 21st century technology of high-speed shipping, which we call magneto-hydrodynamic shipping, magnetically driven ships. You see, today's propeller blade technology, which actually, even if it's a nuclear submarine, goes back to the 19th century, simply cannot move the water fast enough to compensate for the interference caused by their own motion. But with magnetic shipping, a magnetic field is created through coils around tubes of seawater. These are shot through by an electric current, and the ionized seawater is propelled out the back of the ship, moving it the way a jet plane moves. And very, very fast speeds are possible this way. During the past decades of famine and genocide in Africa, Lyndon LaRouche and EIR magazine have stood alone in demanding a comprehensive program to save the continent. For all the many questioners this morning who asked, what can we do to save Africa, I urge you to get a hold of our book, The Industrialization of Africa, which lays out these programs in a tremendous amount of detail. Circulate it, translate it, get it printed all over the continent in many millions of copies. That would be one of the best things that you could do. In 1974, Mr. LaRouche headed a task force which predicted that without massive infrastructure projects and food development, diseases which could kill off all humanity might develop in Africa. Not until 1985, 11 years later, was the AIDS virus even discovered. The black lines you see here are the existing rail grid of Africa, courtesy of the genocidal British Empire and the IMF. This is absolutely pitiful. These rail lines were built by the conquering parties solely only on the coast so that the colonial powers could ship out raw materials and labor and not bother to ship in a thing. Africa's basic transcontinental rail lines have never been built. As Mr. LaRouche described this morning, Britain stopped France from building a basic east-west trunk line from Dakar in Senegal over to the opposite coast, Djibouti on the Indian Ocean. The British did build one single Cape to Cairo railroad. This was done primarily for military control, and today you can see that whole sections of this have collapsed, are in disrepair, and one cannot even any longer get from the Cape to Cairo. Average rail track density today in Africa is only 150 kilometers of track per 1 million inhabitants. That compares with 700 kilometers per million inhabitants in Europe. The red lines you see now are the new high-speed rail systems which Linda LaRouche proposes to build immediately to bring Africa into the 21st century. LaRouche's 1975 International Development Bank proposal called for this kind of a major infrastructure program for Africa. Africa must have continuous north-south and east-west connections and be connected with Europe and Asia. Regions far from the coast and landlocked countries all over the continent must have direct access to the ports and world market. Despite the famines, in fact, Africa boasts some of the most outstanding natural food belts on the globe, but it lacks water development. This is our plan to bring water to every single human being in Africa. And I'd like to say the lady here with the pointer is the one who did this map. This is all her work. Marcia Mary, my colleague. The decline of food output in Africa, in fact, is the result of a deliberate blockage of agricultural infrastructure and technology development in the continent by the IMF. The lines you see here in green are the existing major river system in Africa. There are quite many of them, but there are whole areas in which there is virtually no water. For example, the Horn of Africa, much of the Nile Valley, and large areas are in famine from farm drought. Yet the few huge rivers, such as the Zaire River, formerly known as the Congo River, meanwhile dump huge flows into the sea unused each year. We propose to create the new lines shown in blue and the new lakes, entire new rivers and lakes and waterways. To roll back the desert, Lake Chad, which has partially dried up, as you see in the northern area here, must be rebuilt, as we show on the map. Lake Chad has lost over 90% of its surface area, not only from drought, but from a complete lack of investment in any kind of infrastructure, deliberately engineered by the international banks. By diverting only a third of the supply from the Ubangi River, which now flows into the Zaire River and completely unused into the ocean and wasted, we can rebuild Lake Chad as a gigantic oasis to green the Sahara. We can even create a trans-Sahara canal to the Mediterranean, which could set off further offshoots of irrigation and begin the process of rolling back the entire Sahara. A 200-kilometer pumping canal system can move enough water from the Zaire-Ubangi River system up towards Lake Chad to the Chari-Longoni rivers which feed Lake Chad. Further south, in the center of Africa, we can easily create a Central African lake by damming a part of the Zaire River. This is our combined transcontinental rail and water projects grid for Africa, and it shows clearly that Africa can feed billions of people. In Sudan, for example, we could build a canal, which is already being worked on by the government there, to increase the flow of the Nile River by 5%, which would be gigantic for a river this size. Where the Nile rises, there are marshes known as the Sud Swamp in Sudan, and construction of a channel from Yonglai at the swamp downwater to Malakal would regulate the swamps of Sudan, where large quantities of water are now entirely lost by evaporation. Hundreds of thousands of acres of prime farmland would be created. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, LaRouche proposed a great project for Europe. He called it the Productive Triangle. He proposed to build a triangle of high-speed rail, water, and power investment running from Western Europe into Eastern Europe. Here you see simply the major topographical features of Europe as a whole without any political boundaries. It's obvious that the division of Europe by the Iron Curtain was a completely arbitrary attack on the natural physical unity of the continent. Europe is actually a series of interconnected plains connected together by great rivers which form major highways between them. Here you have the political map of East and West Europe. When the division of Europe was ended, it was a tremendous opportunity to develop this entire continent. But the British had other ideas. As Margaret Thatcher wrote in her memoirs, London saw the reunification of Germany as a Fourth Reich, by which, Maggie Thatcher meant, any economic power greater than the junk heap which is known as Britain. Quote, "A reunified Germany is simply much too big and powerful," Mrs. Thatcher wrote, "to remain only one of the players on the European field." Thatcher especially worried that Germany's high technological base and industry would be used to reindustrialize Russia, and Britain's ability to control the continent of Europe and thus the world would be finished. Following a drumbeat in London and New York calling instead of development for IMF shock therapy, and using that term, shock therapy, these plans were dropped. LaRouche called his plan the productive triangle because he centered it on a curvilinear triangle over an area whose vertices are Paris, Berlin, and Vienna in Austria. The idea is to create the triangle with high-energy infrastructure networks. This central triangle of Europe includes the densest and most productive areas of the world. As you know, Berlin is deep inside the former East Germany, and it would have also unified Europe. LaRouche also proposed to build spiral arms, shown here, coming out of the central triangle like a giant spiral galaxy, reaching out across Europe to encompass a market of more than 430 million people. Along these arms would run similar high-speed rail projects and water programs. They would run into Eastern Europe and Russia, through Warsaw in Poland, Moscow, and St. Petersburg. They would run down through the Ukraine, the Caucasus, which you see here, further east to Central Asia, and south and east through the Balkans, which a program like this, by the way, could have gone very far to preventing the complete decimation you see today in the former Yugoslavia. If people had been occupied building these rail infrastructure corridors, they would have had much less chance to do what they've been doing to each other these past few years. And other lines would run down into Greece, Turkey, Lebanon, and connect into Africa, and also down through the Iberian Peninsula, connecting into North Africa through Morocco. Here is the report on LaRouche's program, which we published, The Productive Triangle, Paris, Berlin, Vienna. This 200-page study was sent by our offices in Germany to every head of state in Western Europe. It was sold to industrialists all over the world. 150,000 copies were distributed in the former East Germany alone. We held conferences and seminars on it in every country in Europe, and Mr. LaRouche was finally invited to address forums in Moscow on this in May of 1994. As Maggie Thatcher's shock therapy has been discredited, the LaRouche plan now for the triangle in Europe is back on the drawing boards. On December 10, 1994, the government of the European Union met in Essen, Germany, and approved this plan, which is very clearly based on Lyndon LaRouche's plan, for 14 trans-European network infrastructure projects. This includes 26 high-speed rail programs. They were published in a December 1993 white paper by European Commission President Jacques Delors. This is Western Europe, highlighting France, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and the Benelux countries, the core of what we call the European triangle. What is the big deal about Western Europe? Why focus so hard on Western Europe? The point is not to help the real estate prices in Paris. They're high enough. The point is that Western Europe is one of the only engines left in the world that could rebuild Eastern Europe and thereby serve as a springboard for rebuilding the infrastructure of the entire planet. It's the only area in the world which surpasses Japan in the density per square kilometer of its infrastructure and the utilization of energy. It has the greatest productive potential in terms of industrial output in the world. It has the highest concentration of rail transportation. The statistics here show the intensity with which land is used and developed. Every member in the labor force in Western Europe, I don't know if you can see the numbers, each member in the Western European labor force requires, and this is on average, only 0.147 square kilometers of land. That's a rather small number, and this does not mean they're being crowded in like rabbits and hutches. This means that the land is being used, in fact, gardened very intensively. You have to think of a very affluent skyscraper on Fifth Avenue or something, as opposed to crowding. That is, that the people are able to do an enormous amount with a small amount of land. I'm sorry, you went one slide beyond me. Thank you. Here is Eastern Europe. Thanks to the double blow of 80 years of communism, and even worse than that, the IMF shock therapy, Eastern Europe and Russia have now fallen down to a point where they simply can't get up by themselves. Russia's major industries, the Financial Times of London reported last week, are now producing at only 30% in volume terms of their output of 1989. Infrastructure is falling apart. This morning, we only read in the press that the birth rate in Russia per 1,000 people has dropped from 14 to 9, and the death rate, just in the last 3 years, has zoomed from 11 to 15. This is an incredible drop in the birth rate and rise in the death rate. And the reason for this is the lack of the development of the land area of Eastern Europe. While the West European workforce, which we saw before, functions on only 0.147 kilometers per capita, the labor force in Eastern Europe uses on average 0.188. That's actually a fairly large amount, even though the numbers look small. We have up here some numbers on GNP. We're physical economists. Normally we don't bother with GNP, but I must tell you the difference between Eastern and Western Europe is so huge it's worth showing. The average GNP per person in the average income per square kilometer of land in Western Europe in 1980 was $1.3 million. Here in Eastern Europe, in the same land area, there is produced only about $300,000. It's less than a quarter of the Western European level. Back one, please. Returning back to Western Europe, the bottom three statistics here show you how much more intensely the land again is used by the physical economy. Water in Western Europe in 1980 was consumed by industry, agriculture, homes, and so on average, at 106,000 cubic meters per square kilometer. That's the 0.1064 million number you see. Power of all sorts was consumed at 618 million tons of oil equivalent, and there were 54,700 meters of railway for every square kilometer of land. Forward, please. In Eastern Europe, you only have 67,000 cubic meters of water consumed, about half of the Western level per square kilometer of land. You have about 347 million tons of oil used for the same kilometer of land. That's half the Western European level. And 42,000 meters of railway, or only about two-thirds of the level in Western Europe. We're not proposing here just to build new rail lines, and this goes for Africa and every rail line that we'll show you today. We're proposing to build 21st century leading-edge technologies, just as with the magnetic ships I referred to earlier, which will produce an entire order of magnitude leap in the functioning of the entire world economy. The rail lines LaRouche is proposing in his European Triangle report are called magnetic levitation trains, or maglev trains. This is a prototype maglev train in Germany. Maglev is a breakthrough in what's called drive technology. It's the drive technology of an engine in a railroad train, which is what has led to revolutions in industry throughout the entire history of the rail system of the human race. A steam engine train carries its fuel and its drive, which is the engine, and therefore is limited to this by about 90 miles an hour. Jumping to electric trains, and that goes for Amtrak's decrepit 1940s junk, or even the Japanese bullet train. In an electric train, you no longer carry your fuel, but you are still carrying the drive. You have your locomotive there. It weighs a lot. And in short, any kind of electric train is limited to about 150 miles per hour. Maglev technology, you see here, depends on active rail, and you can see how it's kind of hugging the rail there. The drive is in the rail itself. The train isn't carrying anything. It runs on a magnetic current differential created between the track and the cars, and speeds of up to 300 miles per hour are reached. This is the existing rail grid in black of both West and Eastern Europe today. It's already worth noting that the Paris-Berlin-Vienna triangle is much more dense than in Eastern Europe, or in the Iberian Peninsula, rather. Here in red are the new spiral arms that LaRouche is proposing to build in the less dense areas of Eastern Europe and Russia. Most of these new arms we can skip directly to 21st century magnetic rail. There is no particular need to build mere electronic systems. Here's the entire plan, the core of the Paris-Berlin-Vienna triangle and the arms, with the existing lines shown in black and the new lines we're proposing to either build or upgrade to magnetic technology in red. Now look at the inland waterways of Europe in the same way as we have rail. Here, shown in green, are the existing navigable rivers and inland canals of Europe. This is critical because if you're going to have a very large amount of freight moving around the place, and our program is talking about increasing by an order of magnitude of 100 the sheer bulk of freight that moves around a place, whether it be Europe or Africa, barge traffic is the cheapest method of doing this, and we must have a tremendous amount of it. Western Europe is rich in inland waterways, but there are no general development in Eastern Europe of an adequate system, and almost nothing in Russia. Now, to show you what kind of an economic disaster it can be if you don't have your inland waterways, Marcia, I don't know if you can find this general area, but there's a story that in 1990, a firm in Regensburg down in South Germany, can we find South Germany? Yeah. Regensburg had a firm there had produced this huge boiler which wouldn't fit on a truck or in a plane or on a ship of any particular kind, except it would have fit on a canal ship. They couldn't get it on anything smaller. And they wanted to send it about 100 miles north of Regensburg, just 100 miles up in Germany. They were forced to put this thing down the Danube, send it south down the Danube River, into the Black Sea, through the Dardanelles Straits between Greece and Turkey, all the way through the Mediterranean, through the Straits of Gibraltar, north around Spain and France, and all the way on up to Rotterdam, and then back into Germany, down the Rhine to its destination. And this cost about $250,000 more than it needed to get the boiler where it needed to go. Here shown in blue are the new canals which our LaRouche Triangle plan would put in Europe. At the far right, notice the huge new canal which must be constructed to connect Russia's gigantic Dnieper River, which flows into the Black Sea at Odessa. I'm sorry, that's not on there right this second, but it'll come on in a minute, because that's green. That exists already. This is the new canal to connect the Dnieper, which flows into the Black Sea at Odessa, with the Don and the Volga valleys further east. There is a smaller connection between these huge systems just to the south of that, right north of the Black Sea, you can see there. And to the west, more in the center of our map, are several smaller new canals. I say smaller because they're not quite that huge, but these are rather large projects, which would connect Poland and Russia into the entire Western European grid. Put the green lines of the existing waterways together with the blue lines of the new canals we propose to build, and you can see how Russia and all of Eastern Europe would be connected into a gigantic inland water system. For sufficient power for all this, there is absolutely no question about it. We must have nuclear power. LaRouche in the 1989 Triangle proposal also called for an entire new industry to be created in the European Triangle, which can be easily exported to the rest of the world. The high-temperature gas reactor, or HTGR, which is the next generation of nuclear power, again, an entirely new technology that we're proposing be introduced on a mass scale because it would cause the productivity of the entire world economy to take a gigantic leap upward. Instead of water for cooling, this reactor, for example, uses helium or other gases. This is the huge rail grid that we propose to build across Europe, and you'll recall the existing rail lines are in black. The new ones we would like to build or to put down in magnetic technology are in red. Naturally, wherever you're going to have rail lines, you're going to need an enormous amount of power. You're going to have power lines there. And you can forget about doing this with oil or coal or other fossil fuels. The pollution would be absolutely intolerable. And just walk into an average city in East Germany or Poland and you will see people still choking to death from the level of pollution that burning fossil fuels was enforced upon them by the Soviet Union. So we certainly don't want to do that. But just to replace rotting old Soviet nuclear reactors of the Chernobyl type or put in emergency power needs in Italy where there has never been a proper power grid built, new capacity would be needed to generate 84 gigawatts of electricity. For Europe as a whole, under our program, there will be an additional need for 135 gigawatts. If we set as a target to secure 70% of our electricity needs through nuclear power, which is exactly how France got through the oil crisis of the 1970s. In 1992, Linda LaRouche extended his concept of the European productive triangle for high-speed rail to the entire European, Asian, and African landmass. Earlier that year, the government of China completed the first direct rail connection to Kazakhstan in the former Soviet Union, opening what is known as the New Silk Road. The Silk Road is also known as the second Eurasian land bridge. This is a bridge over this huge land continent from Europe to Asia. The first land bridge, which has much of which has existed for some time, is the long red line running across the top of the map. This is the aging Russian Trans-Siberian Railroad. In July 1992, the first passenger trains crossed the new second Eurasian land bridge, the red line which runs from China's Pacific coast, west through China, across the center of the map, over the border into Kazakhstan in the old USSR, and on to Europe. There is also a third bridge at the south end of our map, running through India and Southeast Asia. We're not only proposing, I want to remind you, rail lines here. These are infrastructure corridors. We're proposing that the land area on a 50-kilometer corridor on either side of these rail lines would be bundled into huge construction projects of transportation, energy lines, water programs, and other infrastructure, creating irrigation capabilities for agricultural development zones and industrial development zones all along the way of the corridor. To this day, more than 2 billion people in Asia are virtually unconnected to the modern industrial economy, working with their hands. So this is the place where the greatest number of human beings in the world are underutilized, as Mr. LaRouche recently put it. He said, therefore, if I can make available to the people of China, India, and Southeast Asia a peasant population still living a marginal existence, modern technology to improve their productivity, we have the greatest possible growth in the total rate of world production. And this map just shows you that despite political differences in places such as the Middle East, which you see here in yellow, many of these regions where the British have created political spats are actually integrated development regions where if you put in the infrastructure, you will see the political infighting will disappear and you can have enormous rates of growth of living standards. Next. Looking at the three main European Asian bridges in more detail, I'd like you to first notice line A. This is the first land bridge. As we said before, it runs across the northern side of the European triangle from Paris through Berlin. And that area there from Paris through Berlin, there is train track on it, but of course it runs right through the middle of the dividing line of former Europe. The trains have never been rebuilt. I've been on them. There's a serious problem with them. And this is one of the first places that we want to put in a maglev line. And indeed, the Delors program, which has adopted LaRouche's idea, is talking about doing that right there. This line A then runs on to Moscow and into the Ural Mountains, out across the old Trans-Siberian Railroad. And this wonderful old line was built in the 1880s and 1890s by Count Sergei Witte of Russia, whose efforts were simply trying to renew here. But the stuff is 100 years old, and it's absolutely got to be upgraded. You cannot move anything like the volume of freight necessary to do this across that line at this time. And it runs all the way across Siberia to Chita, and there to Vladivostok on the Pacific. And from Chita, there is an existing trunk line now, which runs down into Manchuria and south to Beijing in China. All of Line A exists, but most of it, quite frankly, is decrepit. It needs a major upgrade to high-speed rail. Line B1, the second Eurasian land bridge, runs from Lianyungang, which is on China's Pacific coast, across the vast western Chinese desert to Kazakhstan in Central Asia, through Iran, and through the Caucasus to Kiev in the Ukraine, Dresden in East Germany, Frankfurt, and on to the southern part of Europe. The government of the People's Republic of China has recently been focusing on this line right here, B1, which they call the New Silk Road. At a conference on the international coordination of the Second Eurasian Land Bridge last August at Lanzhou University in the People's Republic of China, a spokesman for China's Development Research Council, which is the highest state planning body in Beijing, stated that the cabinet had given a mandate for strategic exploratory work on upgrading this line. It has got to be done soon. Most of this line is single track. You cannot pass a train going in the opposite direction without pulling off of it. And it is almost entirely steam drawn. Almost none of it is even electrified. Line B2, a third main route, runs from South China, across Southeast Asia into Bangladesh, across India and Pakistan, to the main trunk line in Iran. Only parts of this exist at present. Another entire railroad, which Mr. LaRouche has just proposed to build, and he's proposed it so recently we don't even have it on our slides yet, does not exist at all. It would run from Nanning in South China, across the mountains through Kunming, and then to Bangladesh, joining the India line. And this is what happens when you send Lyndon LaRouche someplace. He was there during World War II, and he says, this place needs railroads. I don't care what the studies show. I don't care how high the mountains are. We're going to put railroads in there. This new Silk Road idea signifies nothing less than the revival of ancient routes of land travel which linked East and West. These routes linked the great civilization of the Sung dynasty of China, the Islamic Renaissance of the Middle East, and the Golden Florentine Renaissance of Western Europe. And of course, at the far west is Western Europe, which we visited. Further east is an area called Central Asia. Most of you today only know about it probably because of the devastation in places like Afghanistan. But for hundreds of years in the 12th century, for hundreds of years until the 12th century, the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara in Central Asia stood as centers of civilization. The Mongol invasion of Central Asia in the 13th century destroyed these civilizations and leveled these great cities. And Soviet colonialism has completely ruined its agriculture. We can reverse all this. This is Mr. LaRouche's proposal from EIR magazine to relink this devastated area with a modern rail grid. In addition, which is not shown here, there are major rivers just north of this area which now run on further north through Siberia, dumping untold amounts of unused water into the Arctic Ocean. We can reactivate studies begun by the Soviet Union to reverse the course of these rivers and bring them into Central Asia for massive irrigation works and farmland expansion. At the far east of the Eurasian Railway, because of the great diplomatic progress made by President Clinton, we can now bring the entire Korean peninsula into this picture. The Clinton development accords between North-South Korea and Japan and China and the U.S. mean that very soon South Korea will no longer be cut off from the Asian landmass by the communist regime in North Korea. We can rebuild the rail lines running from the major trunks we saw before through China into North Korea and across a unified Korea. South Korea's industrial capabilities will soon make a reunited Korea into a second Japan. But at the center of the new Silk Road is China. These numbers show the population density of her people. Most of China's 1.2 billion population are concentrated in her eastern Pacific provinces. These people are the goal to which we seek to rebuild this entire Silk Road. China's vast central and western mountain and desert interior is completely underpopulated, on the other hand. Worse, what's called a blind flow, just because the people are so desperate, of perhaps 200 million people have actually left the central and western interior of China since these statistics were produced. That is, since 1980. These people have moved to the coast, further crowding it, because lack of funds for basic infrastructure and agriculture in the interior has made living conditions in the interior intolerable. In his book, The International Development of China, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the father of China, also had a dream, way back in the 1920s. Dr. Sun proposed a dense rail network, especially in northern and western China, to develop these barren areas and tie China together and into the modern industrial world. But today, much of this work remains to be done. This map shows most of the major existing trunk routes in China today. There are a great many other smaller trunk routes which we can't show you because it would simply make the map too busy, but it does make the point that Dr. Sun's dream from back in the 1920s has never come to life, and we intend to make it come true. China today has about 33,000 routes of miles of railroads. That's less than a third of what Sun Yat-sen proposed 70 years ago. Of that, only 6,300 miles is double-tracked, and less than 5,400 miles is even electrified. Look at the major existing rail lines in black more closely. Most of the Chinese lines tend to run east-west. There are very few north-south conductors, although there is one major one we're not showing here that runs from Beijing down to Hong Kong. The idea of these new lines, which we want to build, and to build as high-speed and magnetic rail, is to link China with itself, north and south, but also east and west. China needs to build about 100,000 kilometers of rail line. Shown here are the existing lines in black and the proposed ones in red to give you some idea of what the grid will look like. In fact, the Chinese government is very much aware of the need for this, and there's a major debate on this in China. China is now moving all out to upgrade this major north-south trunk you see from Beijing to Canton. And in fact, they're building an entire second new such rail system just slightly to the west, which will run the entire north-south length of China. Existing water development in China, as in Africa, is grossly inadequate, especially for a country which has 1.2 billion people as China does. A rapid increase in water delivery is the first of several factors needed to increase the productivity of agriculture, thereby freeing the labor force from this extremely labor-intensive rice-based agriculture for industrial employment. China's south is frequently flooded, killing thousands of people every year, while the north is far too dry. New canals to transfer water from south to north have sat on the drawing boards for years, but nothing has been done. Now at last, work has begun on the huge south-north water diversion project on the far left of your screen. This creates 3 channels, which look rather small here, but actually they're, when you consider China is the size of the United States, they're very, very large, which bring water from the source of the southern Yangtze River Basin up to the source of the northern Yellow River Basin. Also critical are expansion and modernization of the ancient Grand Canal from Tianjin near Beijing down to Shanghai, which is the north-south line at your right, and construction of a new canal from Beijing to the Yangtze River, the north-south line at the center. Here are China's presently navigable waterways. They are much more highly developed than the ones we saw in Africa, largely because the civilization is extremely old, but you have not got anything near what you need for a population the size of China's. You see, you have especially the same physical problems as the railroads. There are huge blanks in the development in the north and the central and western parts of the country. LaRouche's program for China proposes new waterways focusing on forging north-south connecting links in the eastern half of the country, as we noticed before. Now you see it in color. The modernization of the Grand Canal from Tianjin to Shanghai is the blue line at far right. The construction of a major new canal from Beijing to the Yangtze River is the blue line at left, and the 3 smaller source diversion canals in the center. This would be the combined existing and proposed waterway grid that we wish to build for China. This could begin the process of actually greening the huge deserts in China's vast interior, the Taklamakan Desert, the Gobi Desert, and the Tibetan Plateau. To augment the entire flow of the water, Mr. LaRouche has also proposed, as with Central Asia, a study which would divert some of the water from huge rivers which run from the north of China through Siberia, again dumping most of their flow into the Arctic Ocean unused. The LaRouche program for China finally proposes to build 1,000 nuclear-powered cities through China along these infrastructure corridors. This is the artist's sketch of a development corridor such as those we've been discussing, specifically for China. In this example, the development corridor would run along a river or a canal. On either side would be main trunk lines of magnetic rail and other high-speed rail lines. Then there would be secondary rail lines for local traffic coming off of these. On either side of the main trunk line and the canal are several nuclear-powered urban industrial complexes where you see the little nuclear power sign. Each of these is a small city, or nuplex as we call them, nuclear-powered city. Surrounding each nuplex city there will be areas of intensive agriculture based on high-level inputs of fresh water, fertilizer, and machinery. Equipment and so forth will be produced at high efficiency by the nuclear-powered industrial complexes in these cities. All along the outer edges of the corridor are new modernized towns. The little circles that you see there, each of those is a brand new town that we're proposing to build. The city center is a cultural center and a place of learning and training to build a new labor force. We intend to do away with the kind of training which teaches peasants, just like dumb cows, how to carry on the same type of manual labor that their father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and ancestors back to 3000 BC have carried on before them. Rather, with the kind of educational facilities we propose and with on-site training in engineering in these infrastructure projects, this quality of city building can upgrade the entire workforce of China for entry into the industrial age. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think what we'll do is we will proceed with the next presentation, and then we can have questions that would be addressed to both panelists, okay? With no further ado, I'll introduce Marcia Mary, who will now discuss the whole question of the development of the United States.
Thank you. And I'm going to begin by just at least taking out and holding up in front of you a map from home, so to speak. This is Orange County. I went to Orange County a few weeks ago when all the fun started. And I brought this map back. It's very dense. You know, it has many famous towns in it. It's on the Pacific. You're welcome to look at it. Some people in the room are from California. But the reason I want to introduce my remarks on the United States with this is that let us think first for a minute what the Kitty TV tells us about Orange County, because I watched this morning. And yesterday, for the first time, they had the former treasurer, Mr. Citron, Mr. Lemon, they call him, testify on why he lost a couple $2 billion if he was such a wizard, so that the county had to declare bankruptcy in December. And he said, well, I'm not as sophisticated, perhaps. I was under-sophisticated. And they grilled him and said, you must have done things wrong. You invested in grade B, not grade A. They went on and on. In other words, what the media will tell you about Orange County is just things like who done it, what are the legal battles between Merrill Lynch, so forth and so on, so that the rest of the counties in the nation, you're supposed to sit back and think, well, if we don't have a Mr. Lemon as our treasurer, I guess we're all right. Well, we better think again, and that's why I brought the map. If you look at this map, it's all color-coded. You'll find that the purple is the hospitals. So what about the electricity to run the equipment? You'll find that the green is the schools. What about the plumbing so you can get all the kiddos together and they can go to the toilet? What about the water treatment plants? What about, and as a matter of fact, next week is the end of the month, is there chlorine? Is there enough money for chlorine for the water treatment plants? This is the real issue of Orange County. And in fact, that's the issue before everywhere else in this nation. At last count, there were about 3,079 counties in the United States. Most of them are smaller and poorer than Orange County, but they're all in the same boat, one way or another. As you know, we have 50 states, and they are in the same trouble. There are more than 150 nations, give or take a few, in the world, and they are in various stages of financial crises. So, and by the way, I'm not mentioning other entities, charities, cultural, commercial, that kind of thing. The point about this is there is no Shangri-La County anywhere in the world. That was classic British royal propaganda right after the Second World War. If you remember the book or the movie Shangri-La that James Hilton wrote, that somewhere in the high Himalayas there's a safe valley and people there can just hold out and do good while the rest of civilization falls apart, and there will be a place that will save family values or something, separated from what is going on hideously in the rest of the world. It doesn't exist. In fact, this morning we heard in the history of hundreds of years long background to how we got in this predicament today of Orange County and everywhere in the world. So this afternoon, that is why we are illustrating what needs to be done, and I am going to concentrate on the United States. And let me put it this way, I want to get physical to begin with as the first part of my talk. So we will begin with the physical resource base of our nation by looking at this satellite map of North America. Now, I'm going to talk about land, water, power, the state of man-made infrastructure, and in fact the state of natural resources, which after all are man-made, and those kinds of things, all of which in our nation have been run down for decades. We're in a decrepit state. Okay, we're not here to do refined analysis, so even though the image may not be so clear, from this satellite point of view, however, we can learn a lot. This was taken over 500 miles above the Earth, And from this point of view, America doesn't look so bad. So that's encouraging. The imaging people made vegetation red. That's a handy way to do it. When you use Landsat data, you analyze it so that the vegetation is red. So look how much red we've got on our continent. The darker hues usually show here desert or rock and so forth. So what you can see is that vegetation covers over 3/4 of the United States, which is in the middle of the continent of North America, and only in the arid southwest United States or northern Mexico in the Sonoran Desert is it rocky and dark. And you can see the snow caps and the snowpack there in the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevadas. So in fact, here's the point. Don't blame Mother Nature or somebody else. The continent is relatively well endowed with freshwater runoff, except for those arid areas. And the land cover ranges from in the far north, taiga or tundra, up towards the Arctic, down through the temperate forests and fields in which we're located, down into the subtropics in Florida and Texas and northern Mexico, and down into the tropics in Central America. So this is quite a wonderful place. The United States itself is in the middle. I'm sure you recognize it, from about 40 degrees north to 25 degrees south, 25 degrees north latitude. And so we have a great deal of potential. If you want to put yourself in the mood, think of it this way. 2 Indias would fit into the United States. That shows you how big this country is. Or if you want to think how small it is, United States entirely would fit in the Western Sahara of Africa with lots of room to spare. So there we are. Now let's get closer to the nitty-gritty of our fellow citizens in this country and what condition they're living in. Now, as of this decade, about over half the U.S. population of 260-some millions of people, it's interesting, lived within 50 miles of our coastlines, the Pacific on the west, or the Atlantic on the east, or the Gulf of Mexico in the south. In other words, half of all of us in this country live in these zones. And this zone itself, the littoral, has about 610 counties and many independent cities, famous ones like New York City, Los Angeles. Think of it that way. Or Chicago, which is on the shoreline, after all, of the Great Lakes. So another way to look at it is, by the way, half of the population of the United States does not live in 25 states. They live in only 9 states, and all those 9 states are on a coastline or a shoreline of the St. Lawrence Great Lakes. That's where we are. Now, in these counties, and in fact in all the counties elsewhere across the United States, the situation we're in is that there has been a disruption in the building of new utilities for water, sewage, energy, and this kind of thing, or repairs even, to the point where we have breakdown all around us. So with that, what I want to do is give you a short report by category of breakdown, because that takes us then into looking at what we have to do about it and what kind of emergency economic plan we should have. Let's begin with water. The way to do this, for anywhere in the world, it doesn't matter, as the next view will show you, is to start with the watersheds in which you live. In other words, the river basins. We're meeting here today in the Potomac River Basin, but there's the famous Mississippi, for example, and there are many other rivers on our continent. There's the great St. Lawrence River Basin that we share as a border with Canada along with the Great Lakes. Now, the point about this map here, we're not going to go through it all 18 basins at a time, because that's how the geologists and the hydrologists have divided up the United States for keeping track of this. Look at the pale pink areas on the map in front of you. These are areas where there is chronic severe water problems in terms of supply for any use, residential, industrial, or agriculture, that we should remedy. First, look at the dark patchy areas on the East Coast, New York, Long Island, then down here we are in Virginia, the Carolinas, farther down into Florida. Likewise, on the West Coast and the Gulf Coast, you see these dark patchy areas. In these places where you have concentrations of population, we have drawn down the wells and the aquifers, the underwater supplies, to the point where they aren't being replenished sufficiently and the salt water is intruding. So while your nightly news may not show you that Florida has a water crisis, if you lived there you would know it, and a lot of you here, wherever you're from, know it. This is the kind of situation we have. Then you take the larger Midwest area, Southwest area, and you see the pink. There's a huge aquifer that's in the Great Plains of the West, the pink area through all these states. The water has been used over decades for activities, and the water level's been drawn down. It's not being replenished. Look at the border with Mexico. You don't see the nation of Mexico, but that's the Rio Grande River. So that area has, the residents have tremendous water problems. So these are just the highlights of the water supply problems we have. So if you hear that there's some problem in California, unfortunately it has happened to be floods this month, but if every few years there's a drought, why should we be surprised? Most of California is a desert, and if you don't provide for water for future generations, then you will suffer, and suffer needlessly, if you don't have common sense. Look at the next view, and this just illustrates the point that I just made. This happens to be the Rio Grande, a portion of the Rio Grande Valley from satellite point of view. The Rio Grande is up in the very far northeast corner of this particular image. It goes from the center there, right down to the right-hand side, and there are other areas. But the point about this illustrates the predicament we're in. The Rio Grande River runs through a dry part of the globe. And in fact, in the 1970s, scientists said there are enough people there in Mexico or the United States such that the water that's available per capita and per square kilometer is used to the fullest at the current level of economic activity. Nothing else should move in, not factories, not farming, not people, unless new water supplies are made available. That was in the 1970s. Nothing new was made available. In fact, the free trade crowd moved in and set up slave labor sweatshops they call maquiladoras all along the Rio Grande. No indoor plumbing for hundreds of thousands of people. The rate of hepatitis is severe, and cholera reached this region, although it is not publicized as of a year ago. So that's the state of decrepitude in our country and on our continent. Now, so you say, okay, here's a wonderful view. If you've gone vacationing there or had the opportunity to see it, this is the Boulder Dam or Hoover Dam out in the Colorado River. And it is beautiful, and it's part of the improvements made in the Colorado River, dams and irrigation systems and so forth, in that part of the world, the southwest United States. But that was done in the 1930s. That was done decades ago. And that entire river basin, the Colorado Basin, was developed. The Rio Grande, which is smaller, was not. Dozens of other river basins on our continent were not developed, or the development was stopped by the domestic arms of the International Monetary Fund after the 1940s and the World Bank. It was proscribed. It was prohibited. So it may look good, but it's a symbol of the fact that we haven't done our work elsewhere. So what do we have? The next view is one you saw 2 years ago. In the upper Missouri, Mississippi systems, which were not fully developed, all the blueprints for having the dams, the levees, the diversionary channels were not finished at the order, the domestic order of the International Monetary Fund through the Federal Reserve System and through their crowd, like the World Wildlife Society and so forth. The blueprints were not completed. So what did you get? In the Great Flood of 1993, you got tremendous suffering, loss of livestock, loss of communities, loss of entire infrastructure because the proper water infrastructure had not been built. But most of this was totally unnecessary. Now, the limitations of time and our computer, which we're working on, and other things prevent us from having a map-like view of the rest of this, but the point is made with water, and the same point can be made in terms of other kinds of essential infrastructure, as you just saw for the rest of the world. I mean transportation and power and so forth. So let's look at rail. The only point I want to make here, I won't show a map of the rail grid of the United States. Here's just a rail yard, and you see part of Burlington Northern Railway, is that in fact the peak of the density of miles of track across county areas in this country was reached in the 1920s, and it's been declining precipitously every decade since then. The tracks are lifted up and so forth. After the Second World War, we had the bankruptcy of Penn Central. The government came in, and there was certain kinds of bailout. And you know how we began this year. Amtrak, the passenger line of what's left of the shards of our once rail grid of the country, is now announcing massive shutdown of of trains, of personnel, and the track will go into weeds and decay. So that, in fact, this is what's happened to the rail network. What about roads, you say? Well, while this was going on, there was an effort to switch over a great deal of freight to roads. Roads have been built in recent decades, but they too are in disrepair. Even if they weren't, it's much more costly to be hauling freight on rubber tires across roads than on railways, or certainly in those two are both more costly than carrying bulk freight on barge canals and so forth. However, the road grid of the United States is in the same boat physically as the rail grid. This is just an example of a bridge that has collapsed. It is estimated that on our roadways, at over 35% of the bridges are in dangerous state of repair. And as you know, every few months you get the news of a bridge having collapsed, so you hold your breath when you go for a drive. And that's the situation we're in. Now I want to get even more basic. Let's take the land, the actual surface area of our part of the North American continent. And I have three views to show you. One is, please ignore the numbers on this. I just want you to look at the brown tones in North America, in particular the United States and Alaska. The dark brown tones show the areas that are called protected areas in terms of federal parks or parkland managed in connection with the World Wildlife Society. Those are set aside to be absent, to have absent any human activity, no railways by fiat, no other infrastructure by fiat. The light gray tones, the light brown tones, look how extensive it is in the West, are under the Bureau of Land Management of our federal government. That means there might be a railway, there might be plumbing here and there for human beings or something at the discretion of whoever's in the federal government. So that ought to alert you about the problem we have. So that there is an issue of a lockup of a certain amount of land, which by decree, that is by definition, is not to have infrastructure, that is to say improvements made for the benefit of mankind. And all I want to show you now is how extensive it is. If you take the entire continent of North America shown here, and you take the total land in square kilometers that is considered protected, that is, there's about 1.5 million square kilometers of protected land on our continent. That's almost 7% of the land of our continent set aside. But if you take out the vast area of Canada and Mexico, you get way over 10-20% practically of some of the United States that's set aside. That's one thing. Now let's look at farmland per se that had been developed for decades that has been set aside. Sorry, there's a small close-up here of California. Let's just look at it because it's so impressive. The dark area, this is Southern California, and the state border is shown. The dark area is protected land already. The new California Desert Protection Act would take out the light brown area as well, And so you get into 40% of the entire area of Southern California that would be proscribed from having any infrastructural development in the name of wilderness, or in the name of nature, or in the name of protection, whatever they call it. Now let's look at the next. The next view, in terms of actual land base, the resource base of the United States, is what has been called the Conservation Reserve Program by name, which has existed for 10 years. It was enacted in 1985 in one of the 5-year farm bills. Now, what you see here in pastel pink and in tones of gray are the counties. Remember, there's about over 3,000 counties, are the counties that have some portion of their farmland committed to not grow food. In other words, this is non-food areas of the country. This is fields that once produced some kind of food. The pink is, it may be a county that has only 1% of its farmland in non-food. But look how extensive it is. You can hardly go anywhere except the deserts of Arizona to get in a county that doesn't have some field removed from food production. The darkest areas, the darkest counties, which is up there in North Dakota, parts of western Iowa and eastern Nebraska, down in Texas in the Panhandle, in Kansas, in our top farmland areas where decades of families, generations of families have worked to improve God's earth. Over 30% of the farmland in those counties is out of food production. By law, it has to stay out of food production because the farmers or owners were induced for financial reasons to get, say, $50 a year per acre to agree that they wouldn't let food be produced here. Now, this has been done in the name of wilderness, nature. This particular map's from the New York Times, which says, great, do this forever. Don't just do it for 10 years. It was just to be a 10-year program. But if you mentally think of what this map looks like with an overlay of the map I just showed you of the federal lands, which are in the white areas of the West on this map, you see that what you have is a lockup of the actual physical land base of the country from the opportunity for us to intervene, to make improvements, to make drainage, to do things to the land so that it can support people and support future generations. That's the situation with actual land. Now let's go on and look at the soft infrastructure. We looked at aspects of hard infrastructure, land, water. We didn't look at power this time, but it's the same kind of picture. What I want to show you here is the issue of, let's take health care. By soft infrastructure, I mean schools, hospitals, museums, things that are absolutely essential, but they're in terms of education or services. This is a picture of all the 3,000 counties in the United States in terms of primary medical care, meaning the kind of general care your family physician would give you whether you're a child or whether you're elderly. And ignore the details of HPSA classification. This was prepared by people who looked at where is there a shortage in your county if you get in trouble and need to be treated of a doctor, a medic, or somebody who can treat you. The red areas are counties where the entire county is a crisis zone for having anyone who can treat you. You fall off your porch, or your baby comes due earlier than you thought, or you have a car accident. Look at those red areas. There are some places up in the Farm Belt, in Wyoming, the Dakotas, that are solid red. There are places out in the West that are solid red because the doctors have moved out. The towns are shut down. When land has been taken out of production, when 30% of the farmland of a county has been taken out of production for 10 years, who needs gas stations? Nobody's farming. Who needs repair parts for a tractor? Nobody's using their tractor. And people move away. They're gone. Depopulation sets in. The doctors leave, and you're in trouble. The yellow on this map, and notice it's mostly yellow, is areas where subparts of counties, local townships or whatever, have a crisis. And if you don't have a car, if you don't have money for gas, you are in trouble. There is nothing there anyway to get to the next county to get yourself looked after medically. The green counties, and that's the fewest, doesn't mean that things are great. It just means that the information wasn't available, or maybe you are in one of the few areas, like Northern Virginia, which has a lot of facilities. But if you're in the District of Columbia, or if you're in most counties of the United States, in Wyoming, in Iowa, and so forth, you are in trouble. Just last week, the teaching hospital of Georgetown announced a massive shutdown of beds at Georgetown Hospital. City Hospital of Washington, DC is on the chopping block. So this is the situation we're in, and this shows it geographically in all 3,000 counties in terms of medics. This is in terms of medics. Now let's look at beds. We can just take a quick look. Before we do, or the way to do that is, let's go back. This was 1939. These are the counties of the United States that are in black, where there were no community hospitals with beds at all in 1939. And I'll show you in a minute we got better, but now we're reverting back to that situation. And one of the biggest killers was bearing children, because you had no hospital to go to have some help. In 1946, as the next graph shows us, despite all kinds of differences after the Second World War, there was a hospital bed building program, so that the line on the bottom of the map at 1946 has less than 4 beds per 1,000 people, but a goal was set in 1946 that there should be, on average, for every county in the United States, all 3,000 counties, of about 5.5 or 6 beds, or at least 4.5, and by the 1970s this was reached. You'll see that year after year there was a hospital building program, and that actually succeeded in reaching a goal. Then they started falling off since the 1970s to the present, when all of the whiz kid, like Mr. Lemon in Orange County, types at the Federal Reserve and locally were running things with junk bonds and all. There was downsizing of hospitals, cutting out of services, and now we don't have the beds per 1,000 people. We are back to counties with no beds at all. That's the problem. Now, another way to look at it is, you get up to the present, and these are sections of the country. Take the West, or the area where Utah, Nevada, and that entire area, you're down to less than 3 beds per 1,000 people in the whole area. So if you live in the wrong county, in the wrong state, or if you live in the District of Columbia in the wrong place, facilities are not there for you. That's the issue of that's the situation. Now, because this has taken place, the actual exodus, in other words, it's internal refugees in the United States, has reached the stage where some of the counties in the Midwest are going back to the official definition of frontier. In the early days of our census in this country, the definition of a frontier was 2 or fewer people per square mile. Well, there are places now that once settled have gone back to that. So the churches don't exist. They've had to shut down. They've already amalgamated. They've shut down. The grocery stores, the supplies, the hospitals. This is the picture we have of the United States. Actual depopulation. Therefore, what we have to plan is, that's why we're here today, an emergency economic program that can reverse all this. In fact, we have this has just documented a physical breakdown crisis in which per capita, per household, or per square kilometer, per hectare, per acre, whatever you want, there is a reduction in infrastructure that we need to make us healthy, make us productive, and have us do our job of laying the basis for future generations. You know, there's even a crazy calculation done by one of these academicians. I think it's University of Minneapolis. Maybe he didn't have something else to do. But you know what else has decreased per capita? The amount of earth moved per capita. It's estimated in the country we only have maybe 7 tons of earth moved per person on some project. That's nothing. Think of a little 2-ton dump truck. I mean, that's only maybe 3.5 trucks full of earth. So that the whole thing has wound down. We're not constructing, we're not building, and that's one way to illustrate it. So, in fact, what we have to think of is declare a national economic emergency, set up the right kind of bankruptcy codes, that exists for businesses or other entities for the whole nation, and launch the alternative to the disintegration that we see in places like Orange County or Mexico or the New York big banks that in fact are insolvent. Have an emergency infrastructure building program. Now, in order to illustrate that, I'm going to begin with the kind of thing that Mrs. Wolfe just discussed for other parts of the world: water, rail, health, soft infrastructure. And I just want to point out here that some of what I'm saying was published in the last 3 years in a campaign booklet, the LaRouche-Bevel program, which was called Reversing 30 Years of Post-Industrial Suicide. And Mr. LaRouche was still wrongly being held in jail, and Reverend Bevel is here today and is going to speak tonight, I believe. And the point is, at the time, many people like Mr. Citron of Orange County or Mr. Greenspan at the time might think, oh, this is completely impractical. You have to be practical. You have to look at where your money is going to make money. You have to be smart. You have to go into those derivatives. But in fact, the kind of thing I'm describing now is clearly indicated from the review we just made of the inventory of the degraded condition of our country. All right, let's begin with water. Without it, there's no life. This is a picture of the continent of North America again, and this is an old project from engineers that goes back years to the 1950s at least. This is what you see here is altogether some water channels that should be constructed that has been called the North American Water and Power Alliance. For short, they call it NWAPA. And some California water engineers after the war said, wow, after we already have those dams on the Colorado, that's not going to help us very long. By the 1970s, we better have some new projects in place. So the Ralph M. Parsons Engineering Company of Anaheim and some other people devised this program, which was debated in Congress in the 1960s, and then later it was stalled, just like all the other projects, most of them we've been talking about today. But what's involved? It's time now to get this back in the forefront of what we have to do. If you take the continent as a whole, up in the Yukon territories near Alaska, there is water that rises in the high Rockies up there. You know, Mount McKinley's up in that area, and it flows northward into the Arctic, unused by human beings. The caribou don't need much, believe me. If you take merely 15 or 20% of this flow and you divert it southward along the dark blue line where you are seeing through Canada, you can bring it down farther in the continent all the way into the United States and even augment, at least by supplementing in water supply into northern Mexico. Up in Canada, north of the U.S. border, is a natural wonder of the world. It's a canyon very high up in the Rockies there. They call it the Rocky Mountain Trench. I believe it's almost 400 miles long, so that once you divert the water that would otherwise flow into the Arctic, it will naturally flow for that distance and reach about as far as Montana, just over the U.S. border, where you would have to have some lift pumps to raise it higher so that it could flow and have the gradient on either side of the Rockies to the west towards the west coast, and otherwise east of the Rockies down into the high plains, the dark blue lines. So that's basically part of the key design of the North American Water and Power Alliance. It was a 20-year building time period. If they had started in the 1960s, we could all be out today enjoying the sights, but it wasn't. Another key element of it is shown in light blue, which is you could even have some navigable waterways. The dark blue is just plain water transfer for use of the water, not for navigation. The light blue could allow barge traffic and you could go from Canada down through the high plains, maybe as far as Texas. You could otherwise connect into the upper Missouri, Mississippi. You could connect into the Great Lakes, and you might connect into the Hudson's Bay. This would allow an incomparable 21st century new inland navigation system that would allow north-south travel on our continent west of the Mississippi, so it would be an entire new opportunity for almost duplicating the population of the United States and Canada combined. As I say, this was not done. You see, otherwise, it's hard to see in the color here, the light green on this map are existing water systems, and they could interconnect with Nawapa, which could interconnect in the Missouri and Mississippi. So that some of the systems that we have built, the Tennessee-Tombigbee River down in the south, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was done in the 30s, 40s, and completed in the 50s. This project of Nawapa is not some pipe dream. It's no fantasy. It's an overdue project on a continental scale that ought to be built. One of the guys who led the charge against it, by the way, was a fellow named Lewis Mortimer Bloomfield, who in 1958 wrote a treatise against intermingling of Canadian and U.S. waters. I hate to think how his mind works. But he was a British intelligence agent, a Canadian resident in Montreal, part of some very dirty outfits that literally interconnected for those responsible with the assassination of President Kennedy. So we are talking about serious obstruction to the opportunity for development on our continent here. Lewis Mortimer Bloomfield founded the World Wildlife Society of Canada and made the prevention of just what I've described one of their top priority issues beginning in the decades of the 60s and 70s. So that's the situation that we face. Now, if we look at additional water projects that interconnect with this, this is the blue area is the upper Missouri and Mississippi systems that could interconnect. There are many rivers there. There's the Red River system, the North Central Division. All that blue area are drainage systems that go down into the Mississippi and into the Gulf of Mexico. The white area in the southern Mississippi has had the levees built, pretty much. They have had some of the diversionary channels. When there is ferocious runoff, it can be accommodated. But up in those blue areas, the infrastructure has been incomplete, and that is the reason for the destruction in 1993. It is true that God gave us a lot of rain all at once in July in 1993, but we had not built the projects that we could have built to prevent the destruction. And what we need to do now is go back and take up these undone tasks. Here's some of what is involved. These next views show you what's involved. Here is an actual proper high levee protecting a town on your right. And then you see the levee with a high bank there and the light period. And then to the left of the levee, between itself and the river, is some vegetation. Now, and so you have both beauty, safety, and infrastructure. And had this kind of thing been built properly where necessary, or now rebuilt in Missouri, in Iowa, in all along these river systems, that we do not have the basis for destruction. And we can look at the next view as well. Because what this is just an artist's drawing of the kind of thing that Mrs. Wolfe described earlier, where in addition to infrastructure that makes use of what exists, we can site nuclear power plants on rivers, on coasts, say Southern California or Florida, and around them have the energy to do what's required in that region of the world, to desalinate some seawater, to actually process fertilizer, to process food, perhaps grown hydroponically or aeroponically, or you can have extensive cultivation out in the fields behind it. This in particular is necessary in places of Florida. We should have this in Virginia Beach. They need it in places in Georgia, near San Diego. There have been companies with designs for what was described to you. One of them is General Atomics in California. In Europe, the famous name Siemens Company, ASEA Brown Boveri. These designs exist. And the safety factor is just heartwarming. There's no need to have the reactors above ground. They can be below ground, the reactor chambers. They can be helium cooled. You do not need these big cooling towers. They can have a more direct system of drawing off the electricity. So there's no issue of a meltdown or radioactivity through the air should something go wrong. It doesn't exist, but of course this isn't being publicized. And they can be in modules. You don't have to build the mother of all nuclear plants and then have everyone freak out. You can have modules of 150 megawatts and put 4 in a row or put 2 in a row. This is the kind of infrastructure that we need. The reason I have this here is you've all been through brownouts and blackouts wherever you live in the United States. The entire nuclear power plant era in this country is at the moment closed. It was announced a month ago that the last nuclear power plants to come online that were still actively being worked on in the Tennessee Valley Authority near Oak Ridge were to be canceled. So everything we look around, the rail system, Amtrak is canceling. The nuclear plants at Oak Ridge, canceling. These water systems, canceling. And you know the current policy about the upper Missouri, Mississippi states is don't rebuild even the levees that existed. Let the river run free. Rivers have rights. They are higher than people's rights. So this is what we're up against. But we need to do the job. We have some continued views of what kind of projects we need. And now, because I spoke about the land lockup before, you know, that conservation reserve program, you're supposed to think it's helping the land to revert to nature. It doesn't revert to nature. It wasn't natural anyway. Things are changing over thousands of years. They're changing. Read Mr. Vernadsky, the father of the nuclear industry of Russia. He died in the 1940s. He was a geologist and a crystallographer, and he wrote about the constant change of the Earth's crust, even without people or creatures. So let's take the Earth. What you can do is something like this. This is plain old terracing. Corn is being planted here. Someone in the audience said if I speak on agriculture, I have to be corny. Here it is. Anyway, this is called slope-back terracing, and in the green bands, they have been graded by human intervention to form slopes that hold back any dirt or erosion or water going off, and you can't see it on this scale, but you can have standpipes in which the water can go down and then be taken out through tiling, through drainage systems. And you're hardly having any erosion at all if you do this kind of thing. So this just shows the kind of thing that can be done and that has been stopped in thousands of acres in the country. You know, it's 35 million acres in the Conservation Reserve Program. That is equivalent to practically the whole land area of the Low Countries of Europe combined, the Benelux nations. So that this is not a small part of our continent that we have to do something about. So as the other, this is what we could do with the land. Now we see what we can do with, this is just one more view. Now we see what we can do in the case of upland, not just massive dams, but throughout North America in other undeveloped watersheds, you can have the kind of small waterworks that control water all the way along the line. So there's no question of the entire city of Des Moines going underwater, which it did in our day and age. There is no need for that to happen. You can have this kind of thing. Here, you do not have terracing for farming. You just have pasture on those slopes. But no problem, as you just saw. This is what can be done, and this is what needs to be done. Now we look at the rail. For the United States as well, to go to the 21st century, since we have so little track and such decrepit rolling stock and equipment, the key thing is to also go with magnetically levitated train propulsion at certain key segments of a renewed rail grid to crisscross the country. This is the same photo you saw before. It's from the German government. It's called the Transrapide. The Japanese have a different design. There are other designs, but the idea is that it's overdue that we build this. In the next map, you will see some proposals. This is from 1991 from the High-Speed Rail Association of the United States. The lines that you see are where studies have been underway by usually state legislators and local people, sometimes businesses and sometimes the federal government. So you see in the northeast of the United States, much of which is a Rust Belt, you could go from Washington, D.C., where we are right now, and it would only take you 90 minutes to go all the way up to Boston on the East Coast, instead of 90 minutes to get to Baltimore in rush hour traffic. You could go from Washington, D.C. out to Chicago in 3 hours. That's about 900 miles on a magnetically levitated, smooth, soundless line. So that, and this area, with the ability to move people and high-value freight, could be renewed as a productive part of our national economy, along with creating the conditions in the southeast for new opportunities for actual economic development in Texas and in the West Coast. Now, you'll see funny things on here. You'll see a line to Reno and a line to Las Vegas. Well, of course, those are major towns out in the desert, and I know we have people here in the room from there, and you're welcome to speak afterwards. So sometimes studies are done just to have a magnetically levitated train in Disney World in Orlando, or just to get the gamblers from LA out to Las Vegas. The technology is fine. That kind of thinking is something else. But this was the actual picture in 1991 of what at least some people in some parts of the country were working on, and it's part of the reality factor of what we ought to be doing. Now let's switch to soft infrastructure. Don't mind that you can't see this. The only reason I have this up here is I want to make the point again about hospital beds and medics, and therefore about schoolrooms, laboratories, cultural centers, symphony halls, all the opera houses that were torn down. We have to do something about this. What this is, it's just up there to underline the fact that in 1946, this act that was passed to build hospitals in the country, and you saw that there was an increase in the ratio of beds per 1,000 people from under 2 up till about 4.5 in the 1970s. This is the kind of spirit we have to have today. This was called the Hill-Burton Hospital Construction Act, after Senator Hill from Alabama and Senator Burton from Ohio. But the point is, it was only 10 pages long. It wasn't a contract on America. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't a speech. It was 10 pages. And if someone would like to have a copy for their respective state or locale afterwards, come up and see me, and we'll make arrangements. And here's what this 10-page act said that then succeeded over the next 30 years in building hospitals. Who should the hospitals serve? Such a hospital or addition to a hospital will be made available to all persons residing in the territorial area of the applicant without discrimination on account of race, creed, or color. And how should you go about finding out where you should locate it? Just the way we're doing now, by using the map. It said, for those states with a density of 6 to 12 people per square mile, build 5 beds per 1,000 people. If you have states with 6 or fewer people per square mile, build more beds. Build 5.5 beds per 1,000 people. Because you have to go longer distance, it's harder, this kind of thing. That's why it was only 10 pages long. You find out where the people, you find out what you're going to do, you set your standard, your technology standard, because you know if you have hospital beds, you're going to save people's lives, and you're going to save every person's life. And that's going to be the standard for your infrastructure, which is what we have to do in the United States. The next image will show you what was done in the 1940s. It wasn't so long ago. If you have to have mobile units, go ahead. Here is a mobile X-ray unit for chest X-rays, because tuberculosis was still a general killer at the time. It had not been defeated. So this unit went to factories, it went to parking lots, it went to schools, and millions of people were checked. When it was found, it wasn't considered something unreportable like AIDS. It was considered something that ought to be treated, that you had a right to treatment. And within a few years, the tuberculosis rate was brought down to almost nil. And the next image likewise shows just what could be done today. We can have mobile CAT scanners to go to those counties right now in Wyoming or Georgia or Mississippi where the hospital beds have been removed, or Washington, D.C., until the permanent diagnostic machines, as well as beds, as well as medics, as well as nurses, are made available in the right ratios per county or per township in order to take care of the people in this country, to make ourselves productive again. So that's the kind of revival we need in terms of hard infrastructure, in terms of soft infrastructure, and the only question that we might have right now is, well, fine, how are we going to do this? Here I can summarize even what was said this morning by Mr. LaRouche in some of the discussion period. We really need to, well, we have a national economic emergency. We should declare it. We should nationalize, federalize, whatever verb you want to use, the Federal Reserve System that is now dictating, along with the IMF and the World Bank, these evil, destructive policies here and abroad. And instead, as the top of the diagram shows, we should have an institution. This is called the Third National Bank of the United States because there were two others in our past, and they actually funded infrastructure. So that this institution could then, as you see on the second level of the diagram, have flows of low interest credit, maybe 2 to 3% interest, and it could go to the entities created for the magnetically levitated train system or otherwise upgraded system, for the NWAPA program project, for the hospital building project. It could go for the bridge repair projects that you see there under highways, to resume the nuclear power projects, so that all of that level of major infrastructure can be then the content of the emergency economic program, which is the alternative to the financial disintegration that we see exemplified by Orange County, and in fact by the state of Louisiana, by the state of Florida. They're all in it. On that level itself of starting these construction projects, segments of new rail lines, segments of new waterways, you would imagine that we would need directly to employ maybe 3 million people, which is shown here on the right side of the diagram. In other words, 3 million new jobs. So the issue would be training, night schools, competent teachers. I'm sorry, everyone who's retired who has a skill would have to go back to work teaching and training or go on site, because then we could change the television programming and we'd have motor pool skills instead of information age skills. But this would be the kind of thing that gives real meaning to some of the initiatives that people are working on. There's the Job Corps, AmeriCorps, that's been started by President Clinton. There's the National Service Medical Corps. But you know what a great deal of them are doing? They're going out in order to study the indigenous mosquito population in the upper Missouri River to justify not repairing the levees that got destroyed in 1993. So they're being taught skills of just how to measure wildlife. Now, I think the wildlife will do much better if we take care of the human life. So that's 3 million. If you get down to what this means, a ripple effect on the third level of this diagram down on the bottom is that selective low-interest credits can then be offered to the companies and to the service agencies to provide the material, the steel, the concrete, the high-level, the wood, the cement, the maglev trains. Some of the airplane manufacturers would be be over time making magnetically levitated train capsules. This in turn would create the conditions or the demand for another 3 million high-skilled jobs requiring a lot of training in real things, metal fabrication, and in other kinds of skills. So if you add it all together, you're talking about a 6 million person job program. You're talking about non-inflationary, a real rev up of the economy. You're not talking slogans or bumper stickers about the get the government off my back or something like that. We're talking about putting people to work. Now, this is the general scheme. It's very clear. In contrast, what do you hear from wherever you're from? If you're from Atlanta, Georgia, you hear that the Olympics is going to save Atlanta, right? Because that's what's going to give the jobs. If you're from Northern Virginia, you're supposed to get a new ball team move out to near Dulles Airport. That's supposed to save your county. It's been said in Mississippi that riverboat gambling will save the county. Well, look at the next image. Whoops, that's not, I have a riverboat, but hold on. The point about that is, that's crazy. I don't know what happened to the riverboat. By the way, last week, the first riverboat casino in Mississippi announced bankruptcy. So much for all that. Yay. It had a half-life of what, 6 months? I don't know, they got 21 riverboats there. So much for that. The sum total of the kind of emergency measures we're talking about, what this means in terms of changing our economy, let me just show you in 2 quick, colorful slides. Let's look at employment and let's look at energy. This is the United States economy. People working per household. I don't mean literally like your household if you have 6 kids or 3 grandparents or something. These are the people at work per the number of households in the United States from 1800, our beginning, till 1990 today. Now, most of the people working per household are in red, and they were farmers. Look at how the farm population went way down, because during that time was introduced tractors, not mule teams, was introduced mechanized harvesting, all those things you know. But look at that bright pink at the top. That's plain old overhead. That is plain. Now, at different times, that might be people in the military, that might be overhead that's essential. You need doctors, you need, in other words, people who aren't actually producing something physical, who aren't mining, who aren't factory workers. You need some overhead. But there has never been a time, as we are in the 1990s, with that bright pink there, where you see most of the entire workforce that's employed is in overhead. Things like brokers, derivatives consultants, newscasters, that kind of thing. 60 channels. Takes a lot of people to run 60 channels on the cable TV. So this is the problem. This represents the condition of our economy where you have everyone in overhead, and as the categories on the bottom show, you have very few people in durable goods, which is green, very few people in construction, which is blue today, very few people in actual yellow, which is transport, very few people in productive labor. But if you launch the infrastructure projects that are overdue, you begin to rectify this otherwise impossible situation, which is causing complete collapse. One of the best examples, and I'm not showing it here on the screen, is every winter, if you live in the northern latitudes, some pipe will burst, there'll be a big flood, and someone will say, oh, well, what do you expect? All our pipes are over 100 years old. But nothing happens. So all of this is to be reversed. The next slide shows a bar diagram of the energy in our economy, and that's another way to look at economy overall. If you take our country from 1800 to the present, and if you take what's called British thermal units, I apologize, we had to use that because of the statistics available. There's better things you could take. But in other words, a measure of energy, thermal, but a measure of energy. If you take all the energy in use for whatever purpose in our country and divide that by the households, down at the bottom of this colorful historical bar diagram graph, you will see that most of the energy by source came from firewood, which is red, for the first 140 years of our country. Then, fortunately, coal came online, which is navy blue. And then you switched into oil, which is yellow, and blue into natural gas. It was announced today, by the way, that we have reached we're now importing more than half of all the oil and natural gas used, a record in the United States, because this represents a close down of the nuclear power potential of our country. It isn't used. But moreover, look in the last few decades, the last 30 years, at the total energy, whatever its source, in use by household in the United States, and it has gone down. The height of the bars has gone down since 1970, 1980, 1990. It is falling way down. Very little energy is in use in the economy for any purpose, and that would be reversed totally by the situation we describe. So the next slide shows the counter view of what to do about the country that I just described. That in fact, the people who say that you have to be practical, you have to get a dog track, or you have to build a maglev, even if they say that, that's the short road to hell. In September, Lyndon LaRouche made a speech about the need for world infrastructure nearby here, and at the time he said we have to do the impossible, and his words were, we have to build a bridge from hell to purgatory, because it does seem impossible compared to just a small local project. But even something on its own merits that's not as foolish as a riverboat casino or getting a ball team in your area, even something like just a little piece of maglev to your airport itself won't do the job. We all together have to fight not only for what's essential for our national economy, but for the situation that confronts us all around the world, all the children in the world, the entire population and future generations. And because of that, I want to close with just some news from a critical part of the world that's very heartening, namely the Middle East. Because what we have there is a shining example of some people who, after decades of strife, hand grenades, death, blood, had the courage in September a couple years ago to come to Washington, and they signed this peace accords, the leaders of the PLO and Israel. Since that time, more accords were signed with Jordan. There's negotiations with Syria. And at the end of October, and just a couple months ago, there was a meeting in Casablanca of 60 nations, and it was called an Economic Summit on North Africa and Middle East development. And if they can start this initiative, we can do the impossible too. And I now want to show you and close my remarks on the United States with just a view in brief of their projects. This is the cover of the report from the government of Israel called Development Options for Regional Cooperation in the Middle East. And they used a satellite photo here of their own region. That's the Suez region there that goes into the Red Sea right in the foreground. Then you see the Gulf of Aqaba heading up northwest, and that's the Rift Valley in which the Dead Sea is located. It goes up towards Syria. That's the region. This is a 250-page report. It has in there, guess what? Water, electricity, soft infrastructure, namely schools, agriculture extension programs, how to get sheep in the region. These are these famous sheep with big fat tails to have 2 lambs a year instead of 1. Very interesting. And this is their development program. If you look at the next view, this is the cover of the Palestinian program for the Economic Summit of the Middle East and North Africa for Casablanca, and it was prepared by the Palestinian Economic Council for Development and Reconstruction, nicknamed PECDAR, which was formed right after the Washington peace accords were signed. Most of this report is for things that should have been started already now but are perfectly self-evident, for literally classrooms, hospital beds, toilet stalls. For 26 years in some places, in camps in Gaza, nothing was built. You have 800,000 people in the Gaza Strip. Half of them are under 15 years old. Almost everyone is unemployed, and most of them make their homes still in camps, not even in rundown houses, but in camps. So the Palestinians report from Casablanca goes village by village for what projects they would like to see done, and including on the West Bank, in Nablus and in other towns, and for a corridor to connect the West Bank to the Gaza Strip for transportation and development. The next image shows the third government entity in the region, which is Jordan, and they call their report, "Tomorrow Has Arrived, Investing in People." This is an analysis by their Ministry of Planning by the Kingdom of Jordan. They also have sections on water, electricity, this kind of thing. I'll now show you, just in brief, what they have, just to close with what is the real agenda of people of goodwill around the world. These are their proposed water projects as of 2 months ago. The nation of Jordan is yellow. The nation of Iraq is green. And you know, in the Jordan River area and the Dead Sea, the water is all totally the available water is totally insufficient for the people who live in the immediate area of the Jordan River. So if you see where the Euphrates rises at the top of the map in the light green area, which is Turkey, the Anatolian highlands, which gives rise to the Tigris and the Euphrates, that's where Mount Ararat is. So the Euphrates comes down through the gray country called Syria, goes into Iraq, and right there is where the Jordanians would like to propose a joint water project with Iraq and Syria and bring on a canal some fresh water into Jordan, because they are completely short, take it down to Amman. At Amman, they would like to run a pipeline all along Jordan to also provide water for that dry area to increase agricultural productivity. And finally, though it's hard to see on the left, the very left of the map, down at the bottom in Jordan, they want to have a canal from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea, and develop that area as how to have a combined water project development. The other images here give the Israeli views of how to develop their area of this region of the world. Namely, at the bottom of the map, they would like to go from the Mediterranean Sea on the left through, the red line shows a conduit, a canal, then go into a tunnel under the red line south of Beersheba and go right on over and carry seawater into the Dead Sea Basin. You know, the Dead Sea Basin is, the bottom of the Dead Sea is the lowest place on Earth. I think it's 750 meters below sea level, but it's very low. So if you can run water along here, the Israelis and also the Palestinians would like to set up some turbines, because you have a 400-meter elevation drop between the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea. You can see it up on top. On the left is the Mediterranean, and on the right is the Dead Sea. Very low. As the water falls, you can produce electricity, and then you could desalinate. That's their plan. Another plan of theirs, you see on the next view, which is a satellite view, is forget the turbines. This is a satellite view. Up on the northernmost part on the left is Haifa, and the light blue line is where you could draw water, seawater from the Mediterranean, take it underneath a tunnel under Mount Carmel, and take it all the way over to the town of Beisan, where there's the 400-meter drop into the Jordan basin. You know what you can do now is through reverse osmosis, that is just advanced membranes. The water has enough pounds per square inch pressure to desalinate itself on the way down. You don't need any electricity. And so when it gets down to the bottom, you have a brine stream, and you can just dump that in the Dead Sea Basin. It's already full of salt, and they mine it for magnesium and potash. And otherwise, you have fresh water. That the lightest water area on the map is a storage lake for fresh water. By this means, engineers estimate you might be able to make the equivalent of the existing flow of the Jordan River system in this area. This is in this proposal. These three proposals I showed you, that is from Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinians, are just 2 months old. They should be underway. And the good news is, last Thursday there were press conferences here in Washington in which a development bank was announced to finance selected Mideast development projects. Who knows which ones? The people who live there, it is up to them to decide. They have taken the courageous act to make the proposals, and this exemplifies our job to create the climate of opinion here and abroad that we can restore the way to think about taking care of the world on behalf of the human race. Look at the next image to summarize the standard by which we might judge what goes on in the Mideast, because this is what, over the years, when Mr. LaRouche was conferring with people there, in Israel, the Palestinians, Iraq, Egypt, elsewhere, this is the kind of map of what he called the OASIS program approach. Yes, build canals in the right places where the hydrologists recommend them. But go nuclear. The atomic symbols show selected sites where you might have nuclear power plants, nuclexes, and there you could desalinate the seawater, and you literally can make natural resources. Men and women make natural resources. Only 20 of such locations is all you'd need of safe, modular, underground nuclear power sources combined with desalination would allow you to make the same volume of water that is now what's naturally available in the Jordan Basin. That's all you need. You could have a second Jordan River. We could make the same amount of water that's in the historic Jordan River, the most famous river perhaps that exists in the world. Otherwise, you could have navigation, you can have ports, you can have this kind of development. So these proposals are what ought to be done. The last slide shows you the problem there. If you can just tilt the slide projector down so you can see the title of this. This also appears in the Israeli report and the Jordanian report. This is equivalent, if you just tilt the whole slide projector, to riverboat gambling, the Red Sea Riviera. This is the World Bank proposal for what to do. Not only are they against nuclear power, they are against these water projects anywhere. They just say, put in some hotels, put in some sewage systems, run a few compressors so you can desalinate enough water for the guests at the hotel, for the casinos. Give them some scuba diving equipment. They can go see the red coral. It does happen to be beautiful there, I'm told. We can have ecotourism. You know, the Mideast is the crossroads for the flyway for all the birds that do go between Eurasia and Africa, and it is beautiful. But we will never live, nor our future generations live, to enjoy this beauty if we don't have real infrastructure. So I don't know if we can succeed in this, but it is not pie in the sky. I do know that we have to try and succeed and build the movement that supports these initiatives, like last week's Middle East Economic Development Financing Bank, which caused the British to go crazy. They staged a fit. The World Bank opposed it. The IMF opposed it. We have to try. I don't know if we will succeed, but who in their right mind would want to do anything else these days? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think now we can have questions that would be addressed to either speaker. You can come up to the mic. And please identify yourselves.
My question concerns the nuclear complexes to be built for Africa. And would the technical and engineering expertise have to come from outside Africa? Is there any of that expertise in Africa now, or would it be a combination effort to develop Africa's nuclear program? And also, with the major water projects like the damming of the Zaire River, would hydroelectric power play a role in that development also? Thank you.
Others may add, but one thing is that on the nuclear power plants, I just want to report the dire situation we're in. There is currently in operation a situation where the FBI or the equivalent checks with librarians at universities and engineering and science colleges in our country on which students from Africa are studying physics, biochemistry and nuclear science by looking at what they're reading at the library and how they are enrolled, so that they can be put on lists by the State Department. And so it could be that they could be, their studies here in future, if there's a way found, could be terminated. That's how bad it is. That's the United States. You can study nuclear science to develop these nuclear power installations at many other fine places in the world. So it's not just the United States. But the question the gentleman raises about African engineers and scientists in particular working on them, it just becomes a very pressing issue in the world, that we have a job to train the echelons of scientists and engineers needed for the scale of projects that absolutely has to be done. Now, it varies. There are companies, you know, some of the famous name construction companies that want to bid for these projects. General Electric, Bechtel, some of the other companies. But I think the point about this and who would work on them and how it would work might best be considered in the way that earlier in our century, some of the families in Pittsburgh, my hometown, that were involved in owning and operating some of the steel mills where steel was needed for purposes during the war, and they didn't want to do it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, well, if you don't want to do it, we'll just nationalize your company and we'll do it without you. So some of the companies involved, if they don't hire the right people or do the right thing, then under emergency economic measures, domestically and in foreign policy, I'm sure we could find a way to build these nuclear power installations. Some of the most famous engineers and talented ones, as you know, that have worked with many years of experience in the Middle East are the Sudanese, the Palestinians, and many others. And Jordan is famous for hydrologists, and there are many, just for certain historical reasons and certain departments at different universities around the world. There are echelons of people, including those that might be retired, who have to be recruited with this. So I'm sure we can solve this. The interesting thing is, in the 3 reports I showed you from the Middle East, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestine Authority, not one of them mentioned nuclear power, even though Israeli Foreign Affairs Minister Shimon Peres, in his book in 1993 on the New Middle East, said, in his view, in tricky situations, why not have an international zone called like an island, only he means on land, where you would have a nuclear power facility jointly run by an international team of engineers, the way you have it for the space program, that you sometimes send up different nationalities. You would have different nationalities cooperated on these islands of nuclear power sites. So that's entirely appropriate. If someplace in Africa wants to do it that way, why not? I certainly personally would like to see it in the Middle East. Finally, on Zaire, there have been detailed studies of this issue of creating a new Central African lake by a certain kind of damming of the Zaire River. The elevation apparently is very handy. I don't know how big the lake would be. The Japanese, who like to get involved in these things, in 1980 studied this intensely and published it in what they call the Global Infrastructure Fund. We can provide that to anyone who's interested. Others in Africa have studied this, but it's considered a very feasible project. You realize that the Zaire River, which used to be called the Congo, as Mrs. Wolfe said, is the second largest river in water volume in the world after the Amazon. Forget the Mississippi. Forget it. I mean, the Danube is just a trickle. The Zaire River is second largest after the Amazon, so you have a lot to play with there.
More questions?
My name is Marie Rose. I'm from Rwanda. But I have, according to what I heard about the economy, and I would like to say that Rwanda, during the war last year, before 1990, Rwanda was one of the few countries in Africa, which the economy was growth. And now, 4 years after the war, the country has been shambled. And according to the program of economy, which I had, and I appreciate that, how can you do in order to raise the economy when Rwanda has a war between the United Nations, which the media has been manipulating using tribal war, which was not the truth, which is the United Nations went in Rwanda in 1990 to prevent, they went there for peacekeeping to prevent the Uganda to invade Rwanda. And the media and the international community kept quiet about that invasion. Instead, to say that Uganda has invaded Rwanda, they said that is the tribal war, and which the United Nations themselves, we are confident for that, they have been destroyed, all the manufacture of Rwanda, all the scientific project of Rwanda has been destroyed by the United Nations, and which they went there to bring the Ugandan people to rule Rwanda. Up to now, Rwanda is ruled by the General Major Paul Kagame, who is a chief of intelligence army of Uganda. And they take him to Uganda to go to rule Rwanda. And after they went there, they are killing people, and up to now, people are being killed. And the media and the international community, they don't do anything about that. And I have a reporter now, which was written by the presidents, by the Kagame. It says like this: he was written for the president of Burundi, so they can go there and kill all Hutus who are there. It says like this: we have a greatest honor to express to you our sincerely thank for our financial and technical support in our struggle, which has ended with the fall of capital Kigali. Be sure that our plan will continue as designed during our last meeting in Kampala last week. I communicate to our big brother, Yoweri Museveni, and we decide to modify somewhat our plan. In fact, as you have noticed, the fall of Kigali has rapidly provided panic among Hutus who have fled to Goma and Bukavu. We have found that the presence of the large number of Rwandan refugees in Goma, and especially in the international community, may impair our plan in Zaire. We will only be able to proceed with our plan in Zaire after the return of those Hutu. All means have been committed to that they will return as soon as possible. Our external intelligence service have intensified their true coverage of Eastern Zaire, and our Belgium, Britain, and American colleagues are in charge of the rest of Zaire. We are shortly expecting our intelligence report, which is make us fear that Rwanda has been conspiracies by some Western countries for the destruction of Rwanda. And we are fearing that this destruction will go through Zaire. And we don't know how the economy, if you can explain us how LaRouche can make the economy be possible by those conspiracies which is going through the Africa of the destruction. Thank you.
I think that, first of all, we have to take into consideration what was discussed by Mr. LaRouche earlier today on the question of Nigeria, Sudan, and South Africa. as the key to rolling back what has occurred recently in Eastern Africa. If we say that we have to build a road out of hell to purgatory, if we look at what has happened in Rwanda in the past year, we know what this hell can look like. And anybody who ever thought that Somalia was the worst thing they have ever seen was reawakened with a new shock as to what can actually occur when there is a decision from the part of very powerful forces that the Pandora's box of total war is going to be opened. This is what occurred there. Now, the first thing that has to be done, I think, is indicated by the special report which was put out on the falling house of Windsor, because we know that it is the Prince Philip and the World Wildlife Fund and their capabilities which are at the core of the operation to destroy Africa today and to perpetrate genocide on African people. And therefore, it is not a problem that can be solved from within one particular country in Africa or one particular country anywhere. What has to be done is to organize new leaders and old leaders around an idea of what humanity as a unified totality must do to save itself and to have a world to give to its children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And therefore there is no, we've come to the point, and I think that what occurred this past summer there shows us that either we address those fundamental issues on a global scale, or we face a total holocaust of humanity. There really is no choice. There's no middle road. There's no muddling through. We either find the people who have the courage to stand up and to begin to organize to do that work, or this is what we face. We have seen what it looks like. And it is absolutely clear that the only type of economic development or economy which exists that coincides with that type of chaos which has occurred there is the rapacious escalation of new looting of Africa itself. We know that that Uganda, for example, is today a British colony. That's what it is financially. And therefore, when we're talking about what to do in this region, we have to address that on a global scale, because that is really the same problem for every single country and is really the arena on which that is the strategic arena from which we have to approach the problem. There is no specific answer on the question of Rwanda, because obviously the first thing that has to be done is to stop, to control, to contain, and then to reverse and to roll back what has actually occurred there. But the strategic linchpins that Mr. LaRouche identified for that in Africa itself are Sudan, Nigeria, and South Africa, because as you can see, if these countries go, then there is really no institutional force standing in the way. There's no force standing in the way of that widening and spreading. It's interesting to note that to give you an example of how this problem has to be addressed, you know that we are working very hard in the campaign for president in France, and we are running our own candidate there. And the reason for this is that Jacques Delors, who had presented these programs for rails in Europe, was a potential presidential candidate, and then he said that he would not run. And the candidacies that are left are woefully inadequate, which is a very nice way of putting it. And it's interesting to note that the significance of this is that obviously if we are going to have a European Triangle program, then we have to have France. France has to be a major part of that program. How are we going to do that if there are people running France who work with Prince Philip and the World Wildlife Fund? Well, we don't think that's going to work. And therefore, we're fielding this candidacy and making a major international effort on that. Now, what does that mean for Africa? Well, what it means for Africa is that if you see that this rail line going across on the right at the rim there of the Sahara, which was the plan where the French had to build a railway from Dakar over to Djibouti, Dakar in Senegal over to Djibouti. This was a casus belli as far as the British monarchy was concerned in the last decade of the 19th century. And there was a showdown at Fashoda, which is in Sudan, what is Sudan, where the British threatened war against France and said, you are not going to build this railway, and if you try, we're going to go to war against you. And there was literally a military showdown of British and French troops in Fashoda, Sudan, and the French backed down. That set into motion the entire series of events which led to World War I. So you can see that what we're talking about, if anybody who wants to say, well, who cares about Africa? What difference does it make? Anybody who says that, first of all, has no idea of history, right? And secondly, has no idea, therefore, of what to do to reverse the type of strategic deterioration that we see today from the standpoint of humanity and its future. And so the railways that we're proposing, what we're proposing for Africa are things that anybody in their right mind would say should be done. Anybody who says that Africa is overcrowded doesn't know what they're talking about. There aren't any people in Africa, right? Anybody who says that Uganda is an IMF success story, which is what you read in the press in the United States, has no idea what they're talking about. Uganda has the lowest collapsing life expectancy of any country in Africa, which means that its mortality rates are skyrocketing. That's what's happening in the jewel of Africa, in the IMF success story of Africa today. Can the humanity survive that? I don't think so. So therefore, this is a strategic issue, but the way in which we have to approach that is that we have to fight that battle from a global perspective, and how we're going to do that globally to enable us to do that in Africa, right? And meanwhile, we have to educate ourselves and educate more and more people so that when we are able to move in and do what's required, we have the knowledge, we have the skills, we have the ideas that enable us to ensure that the countries of Africa and other countries are actually able to survive and to grow, and that they are no longer, that colonialism and all that it represented is finished for good. Are there any more questions? Yes.
Speak of the emergency economic program that can reverse.
I'll repeat it, okay? Go ahead.
When we speak of the emergency economic program, the reversal, and one of the strategies you said we could use was to set up the right kind of bankruptcy code. Could you be more specific?
Okay, the question is, when you're talking about the emergency economic program and that can reverse the world depression, and you mentioned putting bankruptcy codes, right? Could you elaborate on that? Kathy.
Well, of course, the original idea of putting something into bankruptcy was to protect the person you put into bankruptcy. The bankruptcy law originally in the United States is an American invention, actually, and it's a very good law. And what it says is that if you have a factory or a farm, your creditors are not allowed to come and eat you limb from limb, but that the law will protect you so that you have for example, a Chapter 11 of our bankruptcy law. A Chapter 11 bankruptcy gives the person who goes broke or the company or the farm that goes broke time to kind of recoup. Well, we have a very different situation today, which is, of course, as the Orange County situation shows, as the collapse of the entire banking system in Mexico shows, which President Clinton put the whole full faith and credit of the United States behind Mexico, and it's still collapsing. So what that should show you is it ain't just Orange County. The entire U.S. banking system is, in fact, bankrupt. Now, that's kind of a problem, because you're talking now trillions of dollars. So we can either wait for the kind of bankruptcy that hit African countries in the 70s and Latin American countries in the 80s, which is not a protective kind, but the kind where the creditor eats you limb from limb, takes all your assets, sends, you remember Margaret Thatcher sent gunboats to invade Argentina to collect some of the debt. We can wait for that, or what we're proposing to do is actually call a spade and say, yes, Virginia, the U.S. banking system is bankrupt. The chief culprit is our central bank, the Federal Reserve, which is run by this maniac Alan Greenspan, who keeps going to Congress to explain why he has to raise the interest rate because there's too much economic activity going on and too much employment. I mean, this man is an axe murderer. So the Federal Reserve System, which is this illegal bank that's run by Wall Street, which has it's under no control by the U.S. government, has the first thing, that has got to be declared bankrupt. This has to be done from the top. We need protective bankruptcy to be available to counties like Orange County, so as Marcia said, rather than the creditors running in to grab every crumb, we can have money to put in the sanitation systems in the schools and run the chlorine in the city water system so that everyone doesn't come down with malaria all of a sudden in Los Angeles. But the key thing is for the President of the United States, which is really right now the only body, really the only official and the only organization, or as Lynn said, the only agency in the world right now that has the power to really reorganize the international financial system is the President of the United States. The British are so worried about Bill Clinton because he might just get the idea by reading the writings of Roosevelt or even back to McKinley or Abraham Lincoln that you could do this, you see, because we've done this before. George Washington and Hamilton did it in 1789. They said, we're bankrupt. The continental dollar isn't worth anything. Well, all you bondholders, holders of American bonds in Paris and London and Rome, guess what? We're not going to pay you for about 20 years. Now, you have two choices. You can either wait the 20 years to cooperate with us and let us stretch this out and we'll get our economy back on its feet and we'll pay you later, or you can try to continue this war that we've just won. And Hamilton won. We can do this again, and that's really what we're trying to work to with the Clinton administration at this point, where President Clinton has got to understand that he has to declare a protective bankruptcy for the United States. The minute, I assure you, the minute that he does this, the governments of Mexico and France and Germany and all kinds of countries who are under attack by these flight capital speculative vultures, they will say, amen, me too. It will be, it's going to, but I'll tell you, this is exactly the kind of a thing where the United States has got to take the lead. I mean, this lady who asks, how can we do this in a place like Rwanda? And it completely breaks your heart. And the answer is, really, we have got to have a political movement in the United States that is going to force the United States to take the world leadership to see to it that this kind of thing gets done. That can only happen if we are willing to challenge the political powers of these bankers in the United States. And it starts with the Federal Reserve. We have got to nationalize the Federal Reserve. We've got to say that it's bankrupt. And I'm actually amazed that nobody asked how we're going to pay for all these projects today. But Marcia had one flow chart there with how the Third National Bank would do it, but it's got to start with declaring the whole darn thing to be bankrupt. And this is something the President of the United States can do. And the citizens have got to start demanding that he do that. You know, if he does that, quite frankly, he can get reelected. And if he doesn't do something darn near as sweeping as that, we're going to have a real disaster on our hands, because we could have another 4 years of these Newt Gingrich monsters, and then we could really have a very serious situation in the country. So this is exactly the question that has to be raised politically for the elections over the next 2 years.
Any further questions? Yeah?
Wouldn't nationalization of the Federal Reserve be tantamount to deregulation?
Oh, do you mind identifying yourself?
Gene Bivens, Philadelphia.
Could you tell me first what you mean by deregulation?
I mean, if you're going to take away and nationalize, in quotation marks, the Federal Reserve Bank, then there's no regulation on interest rates, which affects everything else.
Oh, no, 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 no. This would be re-regulation.
How would it be?
Major re-regulation.
If you're going to declare the Federal Reserve bankrupt, wouldn't that be deregulation?
No,
that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying the opposite, but let me explain it to you.
Did you say deregulation? Didn't you say to nationalize the Federal Reserve?
Yes, we've been proposing that for quite some time.
And what
And
would be the effect of this?
hang on, and you think that nationalization would be a form of deregulation?
I'm asking you.
No, it would not be. May I explain why?
I want to hear.
Okay, great. First of all, let me emphasize that we're not declaring the U.S. banking system bankrupt. God has done so. The United States has made so many financial errors, which have been described here in the course of the last 50 years of our history, that the banking system, the reality is that it is bankrupt. Orange County shows this. The collapse of the derivative market shows this. The fact that we can't even keep Mexico afloat shows this. So that's just reality. The only question is, are we going to declare this bankruptcy ourselves, have it be a protective bankruptcy, which we turn to our advantage and to the advantage of our allies, to the advantage of these countries all over the world who desperately need American help, American engineers, American technology, or are we going to wait until we end up like Mexico? That's the question. Now, what we're proposing is a massive, and I say very extensive, re-regulation of the financial system of the United States. When the first national bank, as Marcia mentioned to you, we want to found a third national bank instead of this unnationalized private Federal Reserve system that we have now. The United States began with the first national bank of Alexander Hamilton. That's the fellow on the $10 bill. He was our first Treasury Secretary. And he said, we will not have this Adam Smith free trade. He wrote a whole report called a Report on Manufacturers. He wrote a second one called a Report on the National Bank. And he said, basically, Adam Smith is crazy. Free trade does not work. We are not going to sit here and allow ourselves to only be an agricultural backwater to export tobacco and cotton to Britain, and they have all the machinery. We're going to put up a tariff wall. We're going to build our own factories and work up these materials ourselves, and we are not going to depend upon what was then the money center of the world, London, for the capital to do this. What he did, as I mentioned before, is he declared a moratoria. Now, this was not a repudiation such as Lenin or the communists would do. Hamilton was no communist. But Alexander Hamilton declared a moratoria on the massive U.S. continental debt. Ever hear the term, I don't give a damn about a greenback dollar, or something's not worth a continental dollar? George Washington's money wasn't worth very much at the end of the war. We had a foreign debt, as Mr. LaRouche mentioned this morning, which was much worse than Brazil or Mexico's today. So Hamilton called a spade a spade. He said, this stuff is bankrupt. We're not going to make any payments on it for 20 years. What he actually did was he took the debt, the contracts of this debt, and he said, I'm going to do something very interesting. I'm going to take this debt and I'm going to say these funds now become the capital on which I am going to found a bank for the United States. And he called it the First National Bank. And in one fell swoop, he turned something which was a debt of the United States into credit. And he took the amount of money that this was, and he said, okay, we'll call this the capital of the First National Bank of the United States. And from this bank, the United States government is going to issue credit, and this is the flow chart that Marcia had up before. We're going to issue credit for public works to various sectors of the government, and we will also issue loans to the private sector. And he actually began to issue these loans in accordance with the terms in his report on manufacturers, which did not call for issuing credit to riverboat gambling and so forth, but called for specifying productive credit, steel mills, irrigation, later railroads after those were invented. And what happened after the government did this was a fantastic rise in productivity in the United States, so that these loans were able to be paid back to the National Bank and with interest, and the government made money on this. The United States then suffered a series of setbacks. We had various panics. We had the War of 1812, in which you'll recall the British invaded us again and burnt Washington. The First National Bank was closed by a traitor, a subsequent president. We went through this all over again. We went bankrupt again. A subsequent president during the 19th century established a second national bank, said, we're bankrupt. We're not going to pay by bleeding our citizens this debt. We'll freeze it for 20 years, use it, capitalize it, issue credit, get our people producing again, and then we can have money and repay our creditors. And this went on for a long period of time. The Second National Bank was shut down. After the assassination by the British, which Mr. LaRouche described this morning, of President McKinley, people on Wall Street decided that and there was no national bank at all. There was no Federal Reserve, no central bank, nothing, zero. We were completely deregulated. And the people on Wall Street decided that they wanted to codify this kind of a system so that they would have control over the finances of the United States forever. And the Warburg family and the Rockefeller family, literally personally, people who run banks by those names, Chase Manhattan Bank, Warburg Bank, Kuhn Loeb, Lehman Brothers, Mellon Bank, wrote an act called the Federal Reserve Act, which created the Federal Reserve. It was established in 1913. And the way it works is, instead of the U.S. government making the loan the way Hamilton did, under the Federal Reserve System, and I'll be very brief because this gets real technical, but under the Federal Reserve System, the U.S. government goes begging to the guys on Wall Street to borrow the money. And that's called Treasury bills or Treasury debt. And the Federal Reserve is the sort of pimp that markets this Treasury debt to its pals on Wall Street. So whereas under the nationalized Hamiltonian system, the government is loaning money at a very low percent, Marcia mentioned 2%. Right? We loan out money, for example, to a company that wants to produce computers for the space shuttle or something like this. They pay us back. It's only 2%. But meanwhile, we've created a whole new industry. Get smart like the Japanese. We could sell it off later once it's very productive, right? But we created an industry that didn't exist before. And meanwhile, the government is the creditor, and we've got money coming in. We've got more revenue coming in than we're laying out. Under the Federal Reserve System, the government is begging, literally on Wall Street, begging to borrow money to run its operations, which is a completely insane system. So it's what we have. The system we have now is beyond deregulation. It's a banker's dictatorship, is what it is. And in fact, it's incompetent because when the government has to beg like that and the bankers then get control over the flow of the funds, what they do is they send it to the shopping malls and the derivatives and the whorehouses and the riverboat gambling areas because that's what's most productive. That's what's most profitable to them. They also do this because, frankly, bankers hate people and they don't want the population to have the kinds of infrastructure and economic programs that we're talking about. And when you do this over a period of 1913 until the present day, you completely wreck your economy, and finally the whole thing does go bankrupt. So we need to get back to the kind of a system where the government is loaning the money instead of begging it from a group of loan sharks who basically are out to control our government illegally. Does that make sense with what you meant by deregulation?
Okay, but at part of that period of time, I think also we were on the gold standard, and we went off the gold standard, I understand, and it would seem to me gold would maybe have to be reconsidered. I think when we went off, it was valued at about $35 an ounce, and we have not re-evaluated the worth of the gold that we have in supply in the United States. That's just something that I don't expect an answer now because I know everybody wants to go.
I'd just like to say, however, since you brought that up, that you're absolutely right. And in fact, one of the first predictions that Mr. LaRouche made, he's on his 9th forecast, I think it is now, but I guess forecast number 2 or 3 was in 1969. He predicted that if the Federal Reserve System continued in the way in which it was then, and Nixon and the cabinet, the post-Kennedy cabinets continued with the Vietnam War inflation and the shutdown of the space program and the shutdown of our major industries, which they did after the death of Kennedy. Mr. LaRouche said, if we go on with this kind of inflationary printing of dollars and using it for totally non-productive purposes, that we will be forced to take the dollar off the gold standard. And he predicted this, and 2 years later it happened. And all of a sudden, his followers went from about 20 or 30 people to about 1,000 people. So it's exactly things like that that will build you a worldwide political movement if you can study how that's going to happen. So you're right. We do have to go back to a gold standard.
Yes. Can you come to the mic, please?
You're talking about education. I would like to know about your educational center. Do you give a scholarship, or do you train African American or African people who are interested in the development program, who are interested in participating in the development program? I would like to know about your educational center.
Okay. No, we don't give scholarships. It's all on a volunteer basis, basically. However, we have all kinds of various ways in which we go about educating as many people as we can. One of them is through publications, and everyone here should have a subscription to Absolutely New Federalist and to the Executive Intelligence Review and our science magazine 21st Century and our magazine of philosophy and the arts, which is Fidelio, and you should arm yourselves with these publications. We also are, this is the second conference I think we've had in Washington, D.C. in the past, the last one was November 30th. I think that this will be more regular. Our next conference, which will be a major international conference, which will be in President's Day weekend, President's Weekend, which is February 18th, 19th, and 20th, I believe, in a location in the Washington area, which we'll let everyone know. And I think that the way in which the education best occurs is in the process of trying to convey new ideas to other people. And it is through that process of organizing that we make conscious to ourselves things that we didn't even know that we knew. And we force this understanding on our part to become much more conscious, and from that standpoint we're able to learn even more. So that part of the organizing that we're doing and conveying these ideas with other people, organizing with our publications, getting these ideas out to as many people as possible is absolutely integral and is in fact a prerequisite for being able to educate oneself. So I think that other than that, as we do more and more organizing work, then educational activities and classes and seminars and all these types of things flow out of that. But the core of it is really organizing around the ideas that have been presented today through the morning and through the afternoon. And that is really how that process occurs. That's what we're all about, is education.
Yes, I just concur with exactly what she said, and I just want to tell you that because I realize people may want to leave now in order to resume for tonight. But, for example, some of the slides here that are in this color section of this January 1st issue of Executive Intelligence Review, we're producing in the thousands for people themselves to study up or to add to and use in the occasions they need to do their own teaching, do their own learning, and do their own teaching. So I want to say those are available as slides for teaching purposes. And this famous issue, which has rocked the world, I think, likewise, slides and so forth, I mean to aid teaching right here and now, as Linda just said. And this, as this morning's panel may have let you know, this conference today also is part of conferences ranging everywhere from the Philippines and Japan to Mexico, as you heard, and this is taking place. So this is only January 1995. Millions of people are suffering completely needlessly, as we know. But we have many occasions, like Orange County is providing, including state legislatures where private background briefings we're able to do in detail on how to go for emergency measures as things are going bankrupt. So what you ask is a very active question. We're taking up education right now, every day, and we want to collaborate.
All right. So I think it's 5:30 now, and we will reconvene here promptly at 7 p.m. for our concluding session, which is on organizing the movement to give life to the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King and the drive for austerity. And speaking will be Reverend James Bevel, who was the former Direct Action Coordinator of the SCLC, and Dennis Speed of the Schiller Institute. Okay, thank you very much.
Suffering needlessly and having a massive decline in their physical standards of consumption. This map is the European, African, Asian landmass where most of the world's people live. Since his trip to India during World War II, and since the publication of his International Development Bank proposal in 1975, Lyndon LaRouche has been calling for infrastructure great projects around the world to put the most modern technology, now the property of only the few, into the hands of all of the human race. Had LaRouche's plans been implemented, we would not be facing, either here in America or in Africa and around the world, the genocides of Rwanda, the floods, and the other disasters we see today. Rail lines, such as shown here in red, from Europe to Africa and from the Atlantic across Russia and China to Japan, were the great projects which Mr. LaRouche referenced this morning, planned an entire century ago, 100 years ago, by French Foreign Minister Gabriel Hanotaux and Russian Finance Minister Sergei Witte. In an 1896 treaty, they proposed to unite this vast continent with steam-powered rail to bring steam power for basic industry to billions of people who in that day were still working with their bare hands and who are today still working with their bare hands, into the hands of the average person, and to multiply the effectiveness of their labor many times over. But Britain's colonial rule depended on a naval monopoly, on communications and transportation. Britain's empire would have been made obsolete by these railroads, along with their policy of keeping the population at the living standard of beasts, and the British destroyed these projects. The Pacific Basin, shown here, is the home of most of the world's people today. In fact, even Wall Street recognizes that, and they say, well, let them all eat PCs. But 2 decades ago, Lyndon LaRouche, in his 1975 International Development Bank plan, proposed a dozen great projects here. Major infrastructure projects, such as expanding the Suez Canal between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, a massive development of India's Ganges-Brahmaputra River Valley, building an entirely new canal, which he mentioned this morning, across Thailand to link the Indian Ocean to the Pacific and make Singapore obsolete, and a second canal across the Isthmus of Panama. In 1983, Mr. LaRouche published a Pacific Basin report in full documentation which proposed that this entire basin should be circled with superports and new canals. LaRouche pointed out that these canals and cities must be linked by a brand new 21st century technology of high-speed shipping, which we call magneto-hydrodynamic shipping, magnetically driven ships. You see, today's propeller blade technology, which actually, even if it's a nuclear submarine, goes back to the 19th century, simply cannot move the water fast enough to compensate for the interference caused by their own motion. But with magnetic shipping, a magnetic field is created through coils around tubes of seawater. These are shot through by an electric current, and the ionized seawater is propelled out the back of the ship, moving it the way a jet plane moves. And very, very fast speeds are possible this way. During the past decades of famine and genocide in Africa, Lyndon LaRouche and EIR magazine have stood alone in demanding a comprehensive program to save the continent. For all the many questioners this morning who asked, what can we do to save Africa, I urge you to get a hold of our book, The Industrialization of Africa, which lays out these programs in a tremendous amount of detail. Circulate it, translate it, get it printed all over the continent in many millions of copies. That would be one of the best things that you could do. In 1974, Mr. LaRouche headed a task force which predicted that without massive infrastructure projects and food development, diseases which could kill off all humanity might develop in Africa. Not until 1985, 11 years later, was the AIDS virus even discovered. The black lines you see here are the existing rail grid of Africa, courtesy of the genocidal British Empire and the IMF. This is absolutely pitiful. These rail lines were built by the conquering parties solely only on the coast, so that the colonial powers could ship out raw materials and labor and not bother to ship in a thing. Africa's basic transcontinental rail lines have never been built. As Mr. LaRouche described this morning, Britain stopped France from building a basic east-west trunk line from Dakar in Senegal over to the opposite coast, Djibouti on the Indian Ocean. The British did build one single Cape to Cairo railroad. This was done primarily for military control, and today you can see that whole sections of this have collapsed, are in disrepair, and one cannot even any longer get from the Cape to Cairo. Average rail track density today in Africa is only 150 kilometers of track per 1 million inhabitants. That compares with 700 kilometers per million inhabitants in Europe.
Can begin to approach these problems. And I also want to give a short report. My name is Linda De Hoyos. I'm the Asia editor of EIR. There are some changes in this program which I will go through. But before I get into the session, I'd like to report that on a press conference that we had today in Mexico City by Dennis Small, the editor of Ibero-American for EIR, Executive Intelligence Review, and Carlos Cota, who's an executive member of our organization in Mexico. They presented a special report which we have produced on the Mexican debt crisis. It is called, appropriately enough, "The Mexican Debt Bomb Explodes, Who's Next?" This had very good attendance at the press conference. We have to see what type of coverage will come out of it, including the top newspaper Excelsior in Mexico, Financiero, Multimix news agency, and television. And Dennis went through the discussion of the massive capital flight that occurred in Mexico, which precipitated this crisis, and also gave the outline and the history of Linda LaRouche's 9th forecast of the international global financial mudslide which we are now in, and which was manifesting itself very clearly in the Mexican run that we just saw in the last couple weeks. Tonight they are having a seminar to which business and government people will be attending on this whole issue. So we can see from what has occurred in Mexico that no matter what the financial press in London and New York, no matter what the Wall Street Journal would like to say, that we are in a global financial crisis which is unstoppable given the exorbitant magnitude of the speculative debt bubble which exists in the world today, which is many times more greater than the entire amount of world trade. That offers us, on the one hand, a tremendous danger. On the other hand, it offers us an opportunity to clear this debt, this speculative paper away, and to proceed with global development. And it is on this issue of global development that we are going to address ourselves today. The first speaker will be Kathy Wolfe, who is an economist and also an expert on Asia in particular. She works with the Executive Intelligence Review, and she is going to give us an overview of the plans for global development in particularly Europe, Eurasia, and also in Africa. And then Marcia Mary, who is the agricultural editor of the Executive Intelligence Review and also an economist and geographer, will give a presentation on our specific plans for the United States, because I think, as everyone who lives here knows, the United States economy has a tremendous deficit within the actual physical economy. I just want to give a couple of announcements first. First, we still have keys, a missing set of keys which can be picked up back at the desk, the security desk there. And secondly, these presentations both involve slides. And if you cannot, there's a slide screen, and if you can't see this screen, you should probably move now so that you can, since it will be difficult to follow the presentations if you can't. So. Hotel rooms, okay. Okay. Everybody can see now? Okay. So our first speaker is Mrs. Kathy Wolfe.
Good afternoon. In recent decades, the necessary interventions by man into nature, infrastructure projects, projects for transportation, water, power, and housing have been stopped by the bankers of the IMF or simply not been made. Hundreds of millions of the world's population of close to 6 billion people are therefore, as you know, Berlin is deep inside the former East Germany, and it would have also unified Europe. LaRouche also proposed to build spiral arms, shown here, coming out of the central triangle like a giant spiral galaxy, reaching out across Europe to encompass a market of more than 430 million people. Along these arms would run similar high-speed rail projects and water programs. They would run into Eastern Europe and Russia, through Warsaw in Poland, Moscow, and St. Petersburg. They would run down through the Ukraine, the Caucasus, which you see here, further east to Central Asia, and south and east through the Balkans, which a program like this, by the way, could have gone very far to preventing the complete decimation you see today in the former Yugoslavia. If people had been occupied building these rail infrastructure corridors, they would have had much less chance to do what they've been doing to each other these past few years. And other lines would run down into Greece, Turkey, Lebanon, and connect into Africa, and also down through the Iberian Peninsula, connecting into North Africa through Morocco. Here is the report on LaRouche's program, which we published, The Productive Triangle, Paris, Berlin, Vienna. This 200-page study was sent by our offices in Germany to every head of state in Western Europe. It was sold to industrialists all over the world. 150,000 copies were distributed in the former East Germany alone. We held conferences and seminars on it in every country in Europe, and Mr. LaRouche was finally invited to address forums in Moscow on this in May of 1994. As Maggie Thatcher's shock therapy has been discredited, the LaRouche plan now for the triangle in Europe is back on the drawing boards. On December 10, 1994, the government of the European Union met in Essen, Germany, and approved this plan, which is very clearly based on Linda LaRouche's plan, for 14 trans-European network infrastructure projects. This includes 26 high-speed rail programs. They were published in a December 1993 white paper by European Commission President Jacques Delors. This is Western Europe, highlighting France, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and the Benelux countries, the core of what we call the European triangle. What is the big deal about Western Europe? Why focus so hard on Western Europe? The point is not to help the real estate prices in Paris. They're high enough. The point is that Western Europe is one of the only engines left in the world that could rebuild Eastern Europe and thereby serve as a springboard for rebuilding the infrastructure of the entire planet. It's the only area in the world which surpasses Japan in the density per square kilometer of its infrastructure and the utilization of energy. It has the greatest productive potential in terms of industrial output in the world. It has the highest concentration of rail transportation. The statistics here show the intensity with which land is used and developed. Every member in the labor force in Western Europe, I don't know if you can see the numbers, each member in the Western European labor force requires, and this is on average, only 0.147 square kilometers of land. That's a rather small number, and this does not mean they're being crowded in like rabbits and hutches. This means that the land is being used, in fact, gardened very intensively. You have to think of a very affluent skyscraper on Fifth Avenue or something, as opposed to crowding. That is, that the people are able to do an enormous amount with a small amount of land. I'm sorry, you went one slide beyond me. Thank you. Here is Eastern Europe. Thanks to the double blow of 80 years of communism, and even worse than that, the IMF shock therapy, Eastern Europe and Russia have now fallen down to a point where they simply can't get up by themselves. Russia's major industries, the Financial Times of London reported last week, are now producing at only 30% in volume terms of their output of 1989. Infrastructure is falling apart. This morning, we only read in the press that the birth rate in Russia per 1,000 people has dropped from 14 to 9, and the death rate, just in the last 3 years, has zoomed from 11 to 15. This is an incredible drop in the birth rate and rise in the death rate. And the reason for this is the lack of the development of the land area of Eastern Europe. While the West European workforce, which we saw before, functions on only 0.147 kilometers per capita, the labor force in Eastern Europe uses on average 0.188. That's actually a fairly large amount, even though the numbers look small. We have up here some numbers on GNP. We're physical economists. Normally we don't bother with GNP, but I must tell you the difference between East and Western Europe is so huge it's worth showing. The average GNP per person in the average income per square kilometer of land. The red lines you see now are the new high-speed rail systems which Lyndon LaRouche proposes to build immediately to bring Africa into the 21st century. LaRouche's 1975 International Development Bank proposal called for this kind of a major infrastructure program for Africa. Africa must have continuous north-south and east-west connections and be connected with Europe and Asia. Regions far from the coast and landlocked countries all over the continent must have direct access to the ports and world market. Despite the famines, in fact, Africa boasts some of the most outstanding natural food belts on the globe, but it lacks water development. This is our plan to bring water to every single human being in Africa, and I'd like to say the lady here with the pointer is the one who did this map. This is all her work. Marcia Mary, my colleague. The decline of food output in Africa, in fact, is the result of a deliberate blockage of agricultural infrastructure and technology development in the continent by the IMF. The lines you see here in green are the existing major river system in Africa. There are quite many of them, but there are whole areas in which there is virtually no water. For example, the Horn of Africa, much of the Nile Valley, and large areas are in famine from farm drought. Yet the few huge rivers, such as the Zaire River, formerly known as the Congo River, meanwhile dump huge flows into the sea unused each year. We propose to create the new lines shown in blue and the new lakes, entire new rivers and lakes and waterways. To roll back the desert, Lake Chad, which has partially dried up, as you see in the northern area here, must be rebuilt, as we show on the map. Lake Chad has lost over 90% of its surface area, not only from drought, but from a complete lack of investment in any kind of infrastructure, deliberately engineered by the international banks. By diverting only a third of the supply from the Ubangi River, which now flows into the Zaire River and completely unused into the ocean and wasted, we can rebuild Lake Chad as a gigantic oasis to green the Sahara. We can even create a trans-Sahara canal to the Mediterranean, which could set off further offshoots of irrigation and begin the process of rolling back the entire Sahara. A 200-kilometer pumping canal system can move enough water from the Zaire-Ubangi River system up towards Lake Chad to the Chari-Longoni rivers, which feed Lake Chad. Further south, in the center of Africa, we can easily create a Central African lake by damming a part of the Zaire River. This is our combined transcontinental rail and water projects grid for Africa, and it shows clearly that Africa can feed billions of people. In Sudan, for example, we could build a canal, which is already being worked on by the government there, to increase the flow of the Nile River by 5%, which would be gigantic for a river this size. Where the Nile rises, there are marshes known as the Sud Swamp in Sudan, and construction of a channel from Yonglai at the swamp downwater to Malakal would regulate the swamps of Sudan, where large quantities of water are now entirely lost by evaporation. Hundreds of thousands of acres of prime farmland would be created. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, LaRouche proposed a great project for Europe. He called it the Productive Triangle. He proposed to build a triangle of high-speed rail, water, and power investment running from Western Europe into Eastern Europe. Here you see simply the major topographical features of Europe as a whole without any political boundaries. It's obvious that the division of Europe by the Iron Curtain was a completely arbitrary attack on the natural physical unity of the continent. Europe is actually a series of interconnected plains connected together by great rivers which form major highways between them. Here you have the political map of East and West Europe. When the division of Europe was ended, it was a tremendous opportunity to develop this entire continent. But the British had other ideas. As Margaret Thatcher wrote in her memoirs, London saw the reunification of Germany as a Fourth Reich, by which, Maggie Thatcher meant, any economic power greater than the junk heap which is known as Britain. Quote, "A reunified Germany is simply much too big and powerful," Mrs. Thatcher wrote, "to remain only one of the players on the European field." Thatcher especially worried that Germany's high technological base and industry would be used to reindustrialize Russia, and Britain's ability to control the continent of Europe, and thus the world would be finished. Following a drumbeat in London and New York calling instead of development for IMF shock therapy, and using that term, shock therapy, these plans were dropped. LaRouche called his plan the productive triangle because he centered it on a curvilinear triangle over an area whose vertices are Paris, Berlin, and Vienna in Austria. The idea is to create the triangle with high-energy infrastructure networks. This central triangle of Europe includes the densest and most productive areas of the world. In Western Europe in 1980 was $1.3 million. Here in Eastern Europe, in the same land area, there is produced only about $300,000. It's less than a quarter of the Western European level. Back one, please. Returning back to Western Europe, the bottom three statistics here show you how much more intensely the land again is used by the physical economy. Water in Western Europe in 1980 was consumed by industry, agriculture, homes, and so on average, at 106,000 cubic meters per square kilometer. That's the 0.1064 million number you see. Power of all sorts was consumed at 618 million tons of oil equivalent, and there were 54,700 meters of railway for every square kilometer of land. Forward, please. In Eastern Europe, you only have 67,000 cubic meters of water consumed, about half of the Western level per square kilometer of land. You have about 347 million tons of oil used for the same kilometer of land. That's half the Western European level. And 42,000 meters of railway, or only about two-thirds of the level in Western Europe. We're not proposing here just to build new rail lines, and this goes for Africa and every rail line that we'll show you today. We're proposing to build 21st century leading-edge technologies, just as with the magnetic ships I referred to earlier, which will produce an entire order of magnitude leap in the functioning of the entire world economy. The rail lines LaRouche is proposing in his European Triangle report are called magnetic levitation trains, or maglev trains. This is a prototype maglev train in Germany. Maglev is a breakthrough in what's called drive technology. It's the drive technology of an engine in a railroad train, which is what has led to revolutions in industry throughout the entire history of the rail system of the human race. A steam engine train carries its fuel and its drive, which is the engine, and therefore is limited to this by about 90 miles an hour. Jumping to electric trains, and that goes for Amtrak's decrepit 1940s junk, or even the Japanese bullet train. In an electric train, you no longer carry your fuel, but you are still carrying the drive. You have your locomotive there. It weighs a lot. And in short, any kind of electric train is limited to about 150 miles per hour. Maglev technology, you see here, depends on active rail, and you can see how it's kind of hugging the rail there. The drive is in the rail itself. The train isn't carrying anything. It runs on a magnetic current differential created between the track and the cars, and speeds of up to 300 miles per hour are reached. This is the existing rail grid in black of both West and Eastern Europe today. It's already worth noting that the Paris-Berlin-Vienna triangle is much more dense than in Eastern Europe, or in the Iberian Peninsula, rather. Here in red are the new spiral arms that LaRouche is proposing to build in the less dense areas of Eastern Europe and Russia. Most of these new arms we can skip directly to 21st century magnetic rail. There is no particular need to build mere electronic systems. Here's the entire plan, the core of the Paris-Berlin-Vienna triangle and the arms, with the existing lines shown in black and the new lines we're proposing to either build or upgrade to magnetic technology in red. Now look at the inland waterways of Europe in the same way as we have rail. Here, shown in green, are the existing navigable rivers and inland canals of Europe. This is critical because if you're going to have a very large amount of freight moving around the place, and our program is talking about increasing by an order of magnitude of 100 the sheer bulk of freight that moves around a place, whether it be Europe or Africa, barge traffic is the cheapest method of doing this, and we must have a tremendous amount of it. Western Europe is rich in inland waterways, but there are no general development in Eastern Europe of an adequate system, and almost nothing in Russia. Now, to show you what kind of an economic disaster it can be if you don't have your inland waterways, Marcia, I don't know if you can find this general area, but there's a story that in 1990, a firm in Regensburg down in South Germany. Can we find South Germany? Yeah. Regensburg had a firm there had produced this huge boiler which wouldn't fit on a truck or in a plane or on a ship of any particular kind, except it would have fit on a canal ship. They couldn't get it on anything smaller. And they wanted to send it about 100 miles north of Regensburg, just 100 miles up in Germany. They were forced to put this thing down the Danube, send it south down the Danube River, into the Black Sea, through the Dardanelles Straits between Greece and Turkey, all the way through the Mediterranean, through the Straits of Gibraltar, north around Spain and France, and all the way on up to Rotterdam.